my bag and throw me a roll.
Early July.
Just ahead, we return to the central hearing facility in the Hart Senate Office Building here on Capitol Hill for continuing coverage of this week's hearings of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. On Monday, the panel began its formal consideration of the nomination of Robert Gates to be the new Director of Central Intelligence. Former Deputy CIA Chief under the late William Casey, Mr. Gates is currently on the National Security Council staff. President Bush nominated Mr. Gates to take over the agency after William Webster announced his retirement. Nominated for the director's job 4 years ago, Mr. Gates then withdrew his name following questions about his role in the Iran-Contra Affair. Robert Gates, 47 years old, obtained a bachelor's degree from the College of William and Mary and a doctorate from Georgetown University. He is widely considered to be an expert on Soviet affairs. During the opening Monday morning session, senators on the 15-member panel gave opening remarks on the nomination. Mr. Gates then delivered an opening statement. During this upcoming Monday afternoon session, senators entered into a question and answer session with Mr. Gates. We now stand by for the Monday afternoon session to begin.
Hearings will come back to order. We'll resume at this point. Let me say that, and I've not had a chance to discuss this with the nominee, some senators have indicated that they may have a little longer questioning period than we originally anticipated. Senator Metzenbaum has spoken to me about this, and of course we will have to recess at 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, as I've indicated, because of Yom Kippur. Let me ask, we'll have a better sense after we begin to go through the questioning, but it might be advisable for us to think about taking a break and continuing maybe for 7:30 to 9:30 tonight for a couple of hours. Would that create a problem for members of the committee or for the nominee? I've not had a chance to bring this up. I know that he'd love to spend his evenings with us, his mornings with us, and the next several days with us.
That'd be through it.
Would that create a problem?
I'm
if
at your
we needed
disposal,
to?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Senator Hollings first, and then Senator Rudd.
Mr. Chairman, with relation to our distinguished colleague from Ohio, Senator Metzenbaum, maybe I can ease that problem by yielding my first half hour to Senator Metzenbaum, and then on a second go-round late tonight or late tomorrow night, I'm available.
All right. Why don't we?
And give it to him. Now, that doesn't in any wise indicate that I agree with necessarily his question or Iran-Contra. I happen to be for the Contras. And if I could send some aid down there today, Mr. Gates, I would. So don't misunderstand where I'm coming from. But I think Senator Metzenbaum is jumping between judiciary and the Clarence Thomas hearings and up here at the Gates hearings. And if we could ease that pressure a little bit and give him a full hour when he does come, I'd yield my first half hour and get my time on a
Well, I appreciate that, and we might,
Yeah.
let me say to staff for Senator Metzenbaum, if you would notify him that Senator Hollings would yield him his 30 minutes, which would be the fifth person to ask questions today, would let him know, and then we'll have a little better judgment if time goes along. If we don't have to go into the evening hours, Senator Rudman, who's seeking recognition, has indicated to me there are some other committee meetings, ethics committee responsibilities.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, at the risk of breaching confidential information, and the press is all smiling broadly, the Ethics Committee is going to be meeting starting this evening at 6 o'clock, maybe every night, to deliberate an important matter now pending before it. And I deem these hearings extraordinarily important, and I would hope to miss very little of the questioning of this witness. But I did want to put that in the record. I will do what I can. I understand the chairman's need to accommodate the schedule. I agree with the chairman's desire, but I do have that problem and wanted the chairman to know that and make it a matter of record.
I understand. I appreciate that. And let me say we'll endeavor not to go into the evening hour tonight, but it may be necessary. We'll have a little better idea when we see how the questioning proceeds. And we will commence at 9 o'clock in the morning instead of 9:30 in order to again move the process as long as best we can, because we will recess at 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon for the observance of Yom Kippur, not be in session on Wednesday at all. So we will complete by 5 o'clock, time certain tomorrow afternoon, and we will just monitor the schedule as we go along. There are a couple of items that I want to mention otherwise. There was a question raised about Colonel North this morning, and whether in light of the dismissal of the charges, the current pending charges by the special counsel against Colonel North, would it be appropriate for us to call Colonel North as a witness? During the noon recess, I have had an opportunity to have personal conversation with both the special counsel, Judge Walsh, and also with counsel for Mr. North, Mr. Brendan Sullivan, during the noon recess. I was told by Mr. Brendan Sullivan that Mr. North would not appear voluntarily before the committee, would not agree to voluntarily testify without immunity, and without immunity would decline to answer our questions. I was also told by the special counsel that he believes that it could interfere with his ongoing investigation for us to attempt to call Mr. North, certainly if we got into any question of granting immunity to Mr. North. So I would just simply say to my colleagues, having had both of those discussions, it seems to me very difficult and literally impossible for us to try to proceed along that line. I would, however, point out, and I've had the staff research this matter, that there was testimony by Colonel North in the criminal case 88-80, docket number CR 88-80, April 12, 1989, in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. And I simply want to read into the record at this point and make it a part of the record because I think it does relate to the question of Colonel North's relevancy to these hearings. The following question and answer given by Colonel North in the course of that trial. And I read this into the record at this point. Question, referring to an earlier statement by the witness, when you say Director Casey was, of course, aware of that, you mean the use of the Iranian arms sales money for the Contras? Answer by Colonel North, yes, sir. This relates back to the exact testimony that Senator Chafee was asking me about this morning. Colonel North's answer, yes, sir. Question, is that something you had told him? Answer by Colonel North, it would have been back in probably January or very early February of 1986 before the first transaction of that kind occurred. Question, had you told the same thing to Deputy Director of Central Intelligence Agency Gates, that Iranian arms sales money were being used for the Contras? Answer by Colonel North, I do not specifically recall telling Mr. Gates that at any point, at any time in the whole process up through the end of the operation. Let me repeat that. I do not specifically recall telling Mr. Gates that, meaning about the diversion, at any point, at any time in the whole process up through the end of the operation. So I read that into the record. There has been testimony in the court proceedings by Colonel North in relationship to what he might have told or might not have told the nominee in regard to the diversion. But I would just simply indicate, because I've been asked questions by members and others as to whether or not we would expect Colonel North to be a witness. We would not expect him to be a witness in light of the conversations that I've had with both the Special Counsel Judge Waltz and also with Mr. Brendan Sullivan, his counsel. At this point, we'll proceed with the questioning of the nominee. And again, Mr. Gates, let me remind you that you remain under oath. I'm sure you understand that.
Yes, sir.
And we appreciate your comments this morning. Let me say that in listening especially to those remarks that you made at the conclusion of your prepared text, I was struck by the sincerity of them, by the openness and candor of those remarks. And when you indicated in the course of those comments and the comments that you made to us this morning that you had worked very hard to restore what you viewed as the broken trust that had occurred between the intelligence oversight committees and the agency, and both during the time that you served as acting director and during the time that you served as deputy to Judge Webster. And let me say that I had full and adequate opportunity as chairman of this committee to observe your efforts in that regard. And I would concur with what you said. There's not a doubt in my mind that you worked very hard to restore that relationship of trust. And let me simply say, as one senator, I appreciate the fact that you made such an effort, and I think it is an effort that has renewed the relationship of trust, helped to renew it between this committee and the agency. And from my own experience, I would simply say that during the time you served as acting director and then as deputy director under Judge Webster, there was never a time in which I felt you were not forthcoming in terms of providing information we requested, or beyond that, bringing information to us that you thought we perhaps should know, even if we didn't have the foresight to ask the specific question or to ask for the specific information. So I do think there was a policy of going beyond what merely was required, and I saw a lot of evidence that not only did you do that, but you were advising Judge Webster as director to follow the same policy. So I appreciate that. I want to follow up on several questions that have been raised by members this morning in the course of the hearings. And I think these are matters that it's important for us to have in the record so that we can have a full understanding of exactly what you knew, when you knew it. But before I get into the questions that I had planned to ask you, let me turn to what you said in your remarks at the end of your statement this morning. You said, second, I should have been more skeptical about what I was told. I should have asked more questions, and I should have been less satisfied with the answers I received especially from Director Casey. When you look back on it, could you identify for us those areas where you think you should have been more skeptical, and what additional questions do you think that you should have asked that you didn't ask?
Mr. Chairman, I think of two examples that I had in mind when I wrote that portion of those remarks. The first was following the lunch on October 9th, 1986, which Director Casey had with Colonel North, and which I joined. I've testified before that at the very end of that lunch and at the end of a discussion of the Hassenfuss aircraft, in which I had sought assurance that, although I'd already gotten it from our Directorate of Operations, I double-checked with Colonel North just to try and cross every T and dot every I that he wasn't aware through his contacts with the private benefactors of any CIA connection with anything that they might be up to. And in the connection with that discussion, at the very end of the luncheon, as I was getting up to leave, Colonel North made, as I've referred to before, a comment with respect to a cryptic remark about Swiss bank accounts and the Contras. I walked on out of the room, and a few minutes later went back into Mr. Casey's office and said, you know, that just puzzled me, and I wonder if there's something that we should be concerned about there. Is there some problem or something we should pursue? And Mr. Casey basically said, well, I didn't pick up on what he said, or I didn't catch it, and there's nothing to it, don't worry about it. And I let it go. And in retrospect, that's the first instance where I believe if I had the opportunity to do it over again, I would have pressed him harder and said, well, now, no, let's think about this. Maybe there's a real problem here. The second example is after the director and I met with Admiral Poindexter and gave him Mr. Allen's memorandum of 14 October 1986. We met with him on the 15th and gave him that memorandum. And during that meeting, Mr. Casey had advised him to have the White House counsel review the entire Iran initiative, make sure everything was okay, much as I had asked our CIA counsel to review it, and also to think about making it public, that it ought to be made public. And I should have, at that point, drawn Admiral Poindexter's attention to the specific reference in the Allen memorandum to the possibility that if Mr. Ghorbanifar wasn't paid his money, one of the allegations he might make against the United States was that the money was going to other projects of the United States and the government of Israel. I did not push him on that. Similarly, and it's really part of that same second example, when we met with Admiral Poindexter on the 6th of November, and
Say we, you mean
Mr. Casey,
you and
Mr.
Director
Casey and I had our regular weekly meeting with Admiral Poindexter. Casey again recommended to Admiral Poindexter that he have the White House counsel review it, and Admiral Poindexter, as I recall, said, I don't trust Wallison to keep his mouth shut. And I think he may have said, I'll have my own counsel or somebody look at it. I should have at that point pressed harder in terms of saying, well, if you don't trust your counsel, the White House counsel to look at it, maybe you ought to have the Attorney General look at it, or somebody else. I should have pressed harder. So those are really, I guess, three examples that I had in mind when I wrote my added remarks over the weekend that where I think in retrospect, as I've thought about it over the last several years, where I wish I'd pressed harder.
Well, I thank you for making that clear. And again, I know those were not easy comments for you to make. And clearly, reflecting upon them, you feel that you're confronted with situations like this in the future, you would follow a much more aggressive course in trying to get to the bottom of what was going on. Is that your basic viewpoint in terms of what you've learned from this experience?
Yes, sir, and I think that one example that I'm
Some of the questions that have already been asked you and at your answers and to follow up on them. The most important development in the unraveling of the Iran-Contra affair, of course, came at the news conference of the Attorney General on November 25th, 1986, when he explained that a document had been found that showed that the proceeds from the U.S. arms sales to Iran had indeed been used to assist the Nicaraguan resistance. This occurred during a period of time when U.S. assistance to the Contras, other than intelligence sharing and communications assistance, was prohibited by law. This, of course, is what we've been referring to as the diversion, and it became the focal point of the Iran-Contra inquiry. And of necessity, as we've already indicated, it's must be one of the focuses of our hearings on this in this confirmation process. So I want to go back so that we can all determine on this committee during what time you did learn about the diversion, what you were told about it, and what actions you did take. So I want to go back over some of this same ground. You just touched upon it in the comments that you just made. Mr. Gates, you testified that the first time you recall hearing about a possible diversion of funds from the Iran arms sales to the Nicaraguan Contras was on October 1st, 1986, when Mr. Charles Allen, the National Intelligence Officer for Counterterrorism, brought his concerns to you. Is that correct?
That is correct.
When you testified about this matter at your DCI confirmation hearing in February 1987, the Iran-Contra investigation was just getting underway. Now we have the results of that investigation, and one thing that has emerged from that investigation was an interview with the CIA Deputy Director for Intelligence, Mr. Richard Kerr. Mr. Kerr is now the acting director of the agency. We will be hearing from him in the course of these hearings. He did not testify under oath in 1987, but we received his sworn testimony in closed session last Wednesday. Mr. Kerr testified in the late August of 1986 that Charlie Allen came to him with his concerns about a possible diversion. And he testified that Mr. Kerr, then discussed these concerns with you. This could have been at least a month, he said, before Mr. Allen brought his concerns to you on October 1st, 1986. Do you have any recollection of Mr. Kerr's discussing the diversion with you prior to your meeting with Charlie Allen when he discussed it with you on October 1st, 1986?
No, sir, I do not. I think that, in fact, Mr. Allen has testified that when he briefed me on the 1st of October that I seemed to be surprised and even startled by the information that had been brought to me. Now, that's the extent of my personal recollection. I will say that I have read not only the transcript of what Mr. Kerr has said, but also earlier interviews with Mr. Kerr by the CIA Inspector General, which took place 9 or 10 months prior to that in early December 1986. I think it's important in placing this in context, and again, I'm reconstructing at this point the kind of relationship that Mr. Kerr and I had at that time. He had served as my deputy when I was DDI, Deputy Director for Intelligence, and I had certainly supported his promotion to that position when I became Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. Mr. Kerr and I talked many times, virtually every day. We would have hall conversations, we would have many informal conversations, and I believe that Mr. Kerr has testified that on this occasion, when he talked to me, that he had briefed me on several items, and that he did not dwell on this item in particular. He briefly went over it. He indicated, I gather from the testimony, that he did so very quickly. And he did indicate that I told him to keep me informed, and he also acknowledges that he never came back to me. So As I say, I have no recollection of that conversation, and frankly, given the circumstances in which he describes that it took place, that doesn't surprise me.
So again, not only do you not recall the conversation, you can't think of any other time in which Mr. Kerr returned to you with any additional information or in the sense of reporting back to you about these concerns.
That is correct.
Mr. Allen also testified that he took his concerns about a possible diversion to Mr. Kerr in August, and Mr. Kerr's top assistant, John Helgerson, has submitted a sworn statement that he attended Charlie Allen's meeting with Mr. Kerr where the diversion was discussed. And Mr. Helgerson says that Mr. Kerr told him later that he, Mr. Kerr, had discussed this matter with you. How do you interpret this testimony?
Mr. Chairman, I've never denied that Mr. Kerr may well have broached this subject with me. I've simply said that I had no recollection of it myself. I would regard Mr. Helgerson's recollection as adding weight to the fact that Mr. Kerr did in fact come to me.
But if Mr. Kerr did indeed have some conversation with you about it, either for the way in which the conversation occurred, whether it included several other subjects or the circumstances in which it occurred, it did not register with you that this serious accusation was being made.
No, sir, and to the degree that I was concerned, as I say, Mr. Kerr has said I asked him to keep me informed.
In his sworn testimony last week, Mr. Kerr stated that when he told you of the concerns about a possible diversion of funds from the Iran-Contra or the Iran arms sales to the Contras, you replied that you had already heard rumors to that effect. In other words, according to Mr. Kerr, his meeting with you was not the first time you had heard something about a possible diversion, or at least that was his implication. Does this refresh your recollection in any way, and can you recall any circumstances that might have led you to comment about rumors, shed any light on what you might have meant by using the term rumors, if indeed you did use that term?
The only context that I can add, Mr. Chairman, is that I've testified several times that throughout the preceding year or so, we had heard rumors about funding, where the Contras were getting their funding. We had heard rumors about contributions or donations from foreign countries, from the private benefactors and so on. So I had heard rumors about Contra funding, and that's the only context that I can place on what he said. I would note from his testimony, though, that it appears that he was fairly uncertain about exactly what I had said. In fact, when he was interviewed by the CIA Inspector General in December of 1986, he did not have any recollection of that kind at that time.
So if indeed you'd made any comments to Mr. Kerr about rumors, comments that you do not now recall making, the rumors that you would have referred to would not have been a direct reference to rumors of a diversion directly from arms sales to Iran to the Contras?
Absolutely not, Mr. Chairman.
Let me rephrase the question. Did you hear any rumor, or did you become aware of any rumor prior to Mr. Allen's conversation with you on October the 1st about the diversion of arms sales to the Contras?
My memory of this from the very beginning is that the first I heard was from Mr. Allen.
Including even hearing rumors to that effect?
That is correct.
Your first recollection, then, of hearing concerns about a possible diversion would
Well,
then...
Mr. Chairman, I'm mixed up here, and can I just ask one question in the flow? I thought that the witness testified that he had heard. Now, the question you're directing to is in August of '86, and I thought that the witness said that he'd heard prior there to a series of rumors kicking around that there was funding going to the Contras, whether it was from private donations or from someplace. Am I mistaken? Isn't that what?
Yes, that's correct, Senator Chafee. What I asked the witness was, earlier, he described the rumors he had heard as having to do with the Contras getting money from someplace. What I asked the witness was, had he heard a rumor specifically that the arms sales diversions, there were diversion of funds from the arms sales to Iran to give the Contras money. And my understanding, let me restate it to Mr. Gates, my understanding is he is saying he had not heard a specific rumor to the effect that arms sales proceeds were going to the Contras prior to his conversation with Mr. Allen on the 1st of October. Have I stated that correctly?
Yes, sir, and that is my recollection.
Thank you.
Your first, as I say, your first recollection was then in hearing about it from Charlie Allen. It now appears, however, that at least one other senior CI official, Alan Fires, the head of the Central American Task Force, had direct knowledge of the diversion before October 1st, 1986. According to his plea, Mr. Fires was told by Oliver North by late summer of 1986 that proceeds from U.S. arms sales to Iran had been used to support the Contras. And Mr. Fires conveyed this information personally, this is according to Mr. Fires' plea, that he conveyed this information personally to his two immediate superiors in the CIA, Claire George, the Deputy Director for Operations, and the then Chief of the Latin American Division, by late August of 1986. So I'm quoting here what Mr. Fires says in his plea. He told Claire George and the Chief of the Latin American Division by sometime late August 1986. Did Mr. Fires ever tell you that North had made this statement about the diversion?
He did not.
Did the division chief of Latin American Division at that time ever tell you that North or anyone else had made this kind of statement about a diversion?
He did not tell me what Fires is alleging he told the division chief.
So let me put it this way. Did the chief of the Latin American Division during this period of time prior to October 1st, 1986, or prior to the public disclosure of the diversion, did the chief of the Latin American Division ever come to you and tell you about the diversion?
He did not.
Did Mr. Claire George ever tell you about the diversion of funds to the Contras?
He did not.
Prior to its being made public?
He did not.
Did Mr. Claire George ever tell you that North had made a statement to him about the diversion?
He did not.
After Charlie Allen brought you his concerns about a diversion to the Contras, did you ever ask the CIA officials who were responsible for Nicaraguan operations whether they had any information that might confirm Mr. Allen's concerns?
No, sir, I didn't.
Specifically, did you ask Mr. Fires, as chief of the Central American Task Force, or did you ask the head of the Latin American Division chief if they might have any information that would relate to Mr. Allen's suspicions?
No, sir, I didn't. After I told Mr. Allen to see the director and to convey his concerns to the director, he did that on the 7th of October, and we asked him to put his concerns in writing. He did that and gave us that paper on the 14th of October. At that point, I asked Mr. Casey for permission to share with the General Counsel the information that Mr. Allen had conveyed in his memorandum. To the best of my recollection, the General Counsel is the first person that I shared that information with.
So your action was to say to Mr. Allen, we're going to take this to Mr. Casey, put it in writing, and you also took these charges to the General Counsel, is that correct?
That is correct.
Why did you not, since they were dealing directly with this program, since we had Mr. Fires as the head of the Central American Task Force, and we had the head of the Latin American Division obviously dealing with Latin American programs, why did you not, in addition, raise questions to them about Mr. Allen's concerns?
Well, quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, I think that this is one of those areas during that first 2 weeks in October where I could have and probably should have acted more aggressively and involving more people. I had come in the middle of the Iran initiative when I became deputy director. It had already been underway for several months. It was an area that Mr. Casey had handled primarily, and it seemed to me that when Allen came to me with his speculation, and he has variously described his own presentation to me as an analytical conclusion and as sheer speculation, I certainly took it as speculation. It seemed to me that the appropriate thing was to take it to Mr. Casey. It was then, I can't remember whether it was my idea or the General Counsel's, to share Mr. Allen's memorandum with Admiral Poindexter and have the White House counsel look at it, but certainly that was the recommendation of the General Counsel.
Last week, the committee heard sworn testimony in closed session from the former Latin American Division Chief who held that position after April 1986. He'll be referred to, and my question is, Latin American Division Chief number 2. The Latin American Division Chief 2 did not recall any mention of a diversion, but he recalled one occasion when Mr. Fires came to him and asked what to do if he learned something very sensitive about an operation. And I'm now going to quote what the LA Division Chief number 2 said. He said, quote, "Allen came to me and said a very conjectural thing, kind of thing. He said, what if I were to know something very either sensitive or important or scandalous or something about this whole program we're involved in? Who should I talk to about it?" Or something like that. And I can't remember what it was, but it was very conjectural. And what if and I can't remember the wording he used, he's talking here about Allen Fires, but it was clear to me that the conversation had nothing to do with the agency. And I don't remember what I told him back, but I think I would have told him something like, if it's something that's illegal, you better tell the lawyers. Or if it's something that's politically a hot potato, I would take it to the 7th floor, meaning the management floor, administrative floor of the agency. I asked the witness if he remembered directing Mr. Fires to pass the information on to Claire George immediately. And the Latin American Division Chief number 2 replied, well, I think I would have said the 7th floor. Whether I said Claire George, who would be the next one up, or whether I said Casey, I just can't recall. This testimony suggests the possibility that the rumors Mr. Kerr recalls you mentioning in August might have been the result of Mr. Fires reporting Oliver North's statement about the diversion to someone on the 7th floor. Do you think that's a possibility?
I just don't know the answer, Mr. Chairman, to that. It could be. I just don't know.
But had you ever heard anything from anybody else on the 7th floor about Allen Fires coming to talk with them about possibility of a diversion of funds?
No, sir, certainly not. I don't have any recollection of it, and certainly not before Charlie Allen came to me. I don't have any specific knowledge of it.
As Deputy Director for Operations, Claire George was aware of both the Iran arms sales and the Central American program. They were both operations programs, so obviously he was aware of both. He was in charge of all the agency's clandestine operations. After Charlie Allen explained his concerns about the diversion on October 1st, did you ever ask Claire George what he might know about it?
I don't believe so, no, sir.
Again, the reason is that you felt it was more appropriate to take it to Mr. Casey and higher authority. Is that the reason?
That is correct.
The public record of the Iran-Contra investigation shows that Claire George, as head of the Directorate of Operations, assigned a senior Near East Division case officer to work with Ollie North and Charlie Allen on the Iran arms sale, and that the chief of the Near East Division, Tom Twetton, was monitoring the Iran operation closely. Given the direct involvement of the Operations Directorate with the Iran arms sale, why didn't you ask Claire George whether he or any of his people might know something about it, or why didn't you ask Tom Twetton about what he knew about what Charlie Allen might have been saying about a diversion?
Well, again, Mr. Chairman, this is one of those areas where I think if I had pursued this more aggressively, that those would have been natural people to talk to. As it was, I was content, as I indicated in my statement at the opening, to pass the information that I had on to Mr. Casey. I might just say, just to provide a little context, Mr. Chairman, that during that 2 weeks in October, there were a lot of other things going on. I took this action, and I've acknowledged that I should have done more. But I think I wasn't just sitting around contemplating this matter. There were many other things going on at the time. It was the time of the Reykjavik summit. We had a coup attempt in the Philippines, a false Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. We had a break in relations between Britain and Syria over a terrorist incident. There were a number of other things going on, and in addition, I was getting ready to make my first ever trip as an intelligence official to the Middle East, leaving in mid-month. So I was preoccupied with these other matters, and as I've looked back on it in retrospect, I think that frankly I just didn't pay close enough attention to it, and I felt that I had discharged my responsibility by passing the information I had heard on to Mr. Casey.
It's obvious from your statement to us this morning that for a long time you've given some thought about the implications of the question of how much Director Casey might have known about the diversion, not only just since the fires plea, but obviously before that you've been thinking to yourself about how much Mr. Casey knew about the diversion and when he may have known it. He's not here for us to ask him directly. If Oliver North told Alan Fires about the diversion, as he now admits, and as Colonel North has testified that he had told Mr. Casey about the diversion, and if you now believe that Director Casey may have known about the diversion, and you say in your statement this morning you should have been less satisfied with the answers you received, especially from Director Casey, why do you think that he didn't tell you about the diversion, if indeed he did know about it?
Well, with the caveat that at least I don't know, and I don't think anyone does. I think that he must have, he would have done it in order to shield CIA as an institution from the activity. There was a lot of testimony during the Iran-Contra hearings during the summer of 1987 about cutting CIA out, about misrepresentations to CIA by various people involved, protecting the institution, and so on. That if the presumption of the question is correct, then it seems to me that that's as good an answer I can come up with as to his motive.
Indeed, he did know about the diversion and clearly indicated that he never told you. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Is this a painful thing for you to contemplate the possibility that he did withhold this information from you?
Yes.
And now I want to turn to your role in the preparation of Director Casey's initial testimony in the Iran operation, which he delivered to both intelligence committees on November 21st, 1986. You were questioned at some length about this at your previous confirmation hearings, and frankly, some members, I think, came away with an impression that we had not really gotten all the details about that period of preparation. So I want to go back over it. I think it's important. It's a matter about which some concerns have been expressed, and as members have said this morning, it's important we clear the air on any unresolved matters, so I ask it in that spirit. Indeed, the prepared statement that Mr. Casey delivered that day, omitted significant details about the Iran operation, which the documentary evidence showed that you and others at the CIA might have been aware of or might have been exposed to during the previous year. There was no mention, for example, of the speculation that you and Director Casey had heard from Charles Allen about the so-called diversion. That was not mentioned in the statement. There was no mention that the CIA might have known that in the November 1985 flight from Tel Aviv to Tehran was carrying Hawk missiles. There was no mention of the finding the CIA drafted to retroactively authorize the assistance that CIA had provided the November flight. There was no mention of the roles that Mr. Secord or Mr. Hakeem might have played. No mention of Colonel North or Poindexter by name. Now, you testified then and have testified since that you regret that the Casey statement had not been more complete. It was the best that could have been done, you said, under the circumstances, and you have strongly denied that there was any deliberate attempt by you to conceal relevant information from the committees. Preparations for these hearings, the committee has made an extensive effort to reconstruct the events surrounding the preparation of this testimony. And to provide some context for my questions, I'd first like to provide a short synopsis of the events of that week as we understand them. Ask for any comments you may have in terms of its accuracy, and then move on to your recollections with respect to several specific points. So let me first begin with a summary, and if at any point I've misstated the facts or the sequence as you understand them, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Casey's testimony was to be delivered to both intelligence committees on Friday, November 21st, 1986. Casey left on Sunday, November 16th, on a trip to Central America, leaving you with instructions to take charge of the efforts to draft the testimony which was intended to describe the CIA's role in the arms sales to Iran. Is that correct thus far?
Yes, sir. My recollection is that memorandum basically simply laid out a number of things that he wanted gathered for him in preparation. Various documents, briefings on terrorism. He wanted some refreshment on some other ideas. I don't specifically recall whether it tasked me to prepare the testimony, but it asked me to take care of getting these things for him.
So in essence, he left on Sunday, November 16th. He was to testify on Friday, November 21st, and he said to you, in essence, get some information together for me that I'm going to need for my testimony.
Yes.
On Monday, November 17th, you spoke by secure telephone with Casey and obtained his consent for the general approach the statement would take, that it would be limited to CIA's role in the Iran operation, but not attempt to defend or explain the administration's policy. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Casey would deal with the policy questions, during the question period if necessary.
Yes, sir.
Passed this guidance on to the CIA staff at a meeting you chaired on the CIA on Monday afternoon and urged them to pull together the relevant facts. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
On Tuesday, November 18th, you spoke again with Director Casey in Central America and relayed a request from Admiral Poindexter urging him to return sooner than planned from Central America so that he could join a meeting that Poindexter was arranging at the White House for Thursday afternoon to review the upcoming Casey testimony. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The same day, Claire George and members of his staff briefed the staff of the two intelligence committees on CIA's role in implementing the finding of January 17, 1986, but did not cover events prior to the finding. Is that correct to the best of your knowledge?
That's my understanding, yes.
First draft of Casey's prepared testimony was completed based largely upon information included in the staff briefings. That would have been on Tuesday, November 18th, the first rough draft of the Casey testimony.
I think, Mr. Chairman, as we've been able to try and reconstruct it, and I admit that this has been one of the reconstructing these drafts and so on has been one of the most elusive things we've dealt with in trying to put together what actually happened that week. The best picture that I've been able to put together from the testimony and the statements of a variety of other people is that, first of all, we were unable to pull together a draft statement in time to be sent down to Mr. Casey. He had hoped that one of our officers could bring down a draft statement to him in Central America that Wednesday that he could then work on his way home. We had a great deal of difficulty, and you will probably get to this in your chronology, but as of Wednesday afternoon, we were having a great deal of difficulty, the Directorate of Operations officers, in pulling together an accurate picture of, in fact, exactly what had happened, particularly in November of 1985. A lot of the principal characters, Mr. McMahon, Mr. Junowitz, Stanley Sporkin, had all gone on to other jobs and were no longer with the agency. So we were unable to get a draft to Mr. Casey on Wednesday. We think that the first full draft of the testimony that Mr. Casey was to deliver is the draft that is dated 1200 hours on Thursday the 20th. Prior to that, people were basically working from chronologies as best as we've been able to reconstruct it.
All right. So, as you understand it, there wasn't a formal first draft on Tuesday. There were still various documents and various chronologies and other documents in various stages of preparation.
That's my understanding, yes, sir.
And that you didn't, at least you didn't have anything completed in time to send it to Mr. Casey on Wednesday on Wednesday.
That's correct.
Now, again, further, we've tried to go through this very same process here at the committee staff, trying to reconstruct this chronology. According to our best efforts, on Wednesday afternoon, you chaired another meeting with the CIA staff involved in the drafting effort. Do you recall doing that?
Yes, sir.
At this meeting, it became apparent that with respect to the period prior to January 17th, or prior to the January 17th finding, 1986 finding, the staff has conflicting information about it. Apparently, the people you're dealing with have some conflicting information about what went on in the agency or what went on in general prior to the finding being issued on January 17th.
Yes, sir. In fact, the reason that the meeting, that I called the meeting, was that the General Counsel had begun coming across information that indicated a great deal of uncertainty on an important point, which was who in CIA had known in November 1985 what was on the aircraft that flew to Iran. The original premise of those who had put together the chronology and were doing the basic work, most of whom, and perhaps all of whom, had not been involved at that time, so were working on the basis of other people's recollections. Their original premise had been that no one in CIA had known what was on that airplane in November 1985 contemporaneously. But Mr. Doherty came to me and said that, in fact, it was beginning to look like that wasn't the case, that perhaps one of our chiefs of station in Europe had known, that certainly it appeared that the pilot of the proprietary aircraft had known. So the facts, as we got closer to the testimony, ironically, the facts began dissolving before our eyes rather than becoming firmer. And it was at that meeting that Mr. Doherty suggested that we postpone the hearing. And I told him that I did not think that that was politically possible in light of the firestorm that was going on. And so I insisted in talking with him that we be sure and include in the testimony a caveat to the effect that we were still trying to gather facts.
So when you say you didn't think it was politically possible, in this meeting on Wednesday afternoon, when he was saying maybe we ought to wait, not testify before the committees, you were saying you didn't think the committees would agree to wait. They were
That's
anxious.
exactly correct.
They were demanding that someone appear and
Yes, sir.
and testify. Later the same afternoon, this is again on Wednesday, you and Mr. George and his assistant attended at a meeting at the White House with Mr. Poindexter and Colonel North to review what Claire George had briefed to the Intelligence Committee's staffs the day before. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That is my recollection.
And Mr. Casey then returned very late that evening from Central America with well, we have here that he returned with a copy of his draft testimony which had been couriered the day before, but you're indicating you're not sure whether there was a draft prepared sufficiently to have been sent to him yet or not.
We have not been able to find such a draft, Mr. Chairman.
So you're uncertain of that.
Yes, sir.
But he did return that evening from Central America.
Yes, sir.
And on Thursday morning, according to our best information, Casey had a meeting in his office which you attended along with the CI officers most knowledgeable of the Iran arms sales operation to discuss their recollections. Is that correct?
I had lost track of that meeting, but
The next morning after he got back,
Yes,
he
sir.
convened a meeting. Does that sound right to you, that he convened a meeting
Probably,
of
yes,
several
sir.
people to discuss their recollections, and then a new version, or perhaps the first complete version of a statement then was prepared.
Yes, sir.
According to our records, at 1:30 Thursday afternoon, you and Director Casey attended a meeting at the White House with Poindexter, North, Attorney General Meese, Assistant Attorney General Charles Cooper, and others, we're not sure what others, to discuss Casey's prepared testimony, or the testimony he was to give.
When I went to the meeting, Mr. Chairman, I thought that the sole purpose for our attendance was to correct something in the record where there had been a difference between the CIA recollection and the NSC staff, specifically Colonel North's. And I think it came out of a meeting the preceding afternoon between the fellow doing some of the work for the agency on the chronologies and Colonel North, in which there was a difference over who had asked for the use of the proprietary aircraft in November 1985. Our staff was saying that it was in fact Colonel North. Colonel North was suggesting that the Israelis had asked for it. So my sole purpose in going to this meeting, and frankly I had thought that it was the primary purpose of our going, was simply to clarify this and basically say that we had a couple of officers who were prepared to swear that our account was an accurate one. And that change was sort of automatically accepted. There was no dispute or issue over it at all. I might add that a meeting was in progress involving Admiral Poindexter and the Attorney General and Mr. Cooper when we arrived, and they were still meeting when we left.
Excuse me. Would you repeat the last sentence?
Just that Admiral Poindexter had been meeting with the Attorney General and with Mr. Cooper when we arrived, and they were still meeting when we left.
So really, you resolved this one issue pretty rapidly, and that was your major focus.
Yes, sir.
There. I understand that Poindexter was to be meeting with the chairman and vice chairman of the intelligence committees on the same subjects prior to. He'd be meeting with them. That was your understanding, that he'd be meeting with them prior to Mr. Casey appearing. Is that correct, or do you know?
I may have been told that he was going to have that meeting, Mr. Chairman, but I forgot the specific of it.
Well, after the meeting at the White House, where you've been there, you and Casey returned to the CIA, according to our records, for another meeting with the staff to review another amended version of the testimony,
yes,
the
sir.
latest version of the testimony. Now, not everyone had the same draft at the meeting, and there were different documents floating around. Is that correct?
The meeting was fairly chaotic, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Casey made changes in the text, but participants were not sure of what he was doing. Is that a correct statement?
Mr. Chairman, it may be worth setting the stage. This meeting took place in the director's conference room, and there were probably 12 or 14 people there. They were all arguing with one another about what the facts were. There was more than a little shouting going on. Casey was writing and tearing up pieces of paper, and there was just general pandemonium in the course of this thing, and it was very difficult to tell what was going on.
So you weren't clear yourself exactly what changes Mr. Casey was making in the text?
That is correct.
I have to say, having been on the committee when we had special earpieces fixed in our hearing room so that we could hear Mr. Casey more clearly and try to understand what he was saying to the committee at all times, I can understand that. Our attempts technologically to improve the clarity of what he was saying were unsuccessful, I might say, too, during this period of time in the committee. It's clear, however, that the differing recollections of the period prior to January 1986 were offered. What was going on, what had gone on prior. In this meeting, there were various competing
There was
views.
a lot of debate, particularly over it. I think most of the dispute was over the period prior to the January 1986 finding.
As far as you're personally concerned, was this your last involvement in the statement per se?
Yes, sir. The last full type draft that I saw before Mr. Casey testified, or that I read, was the one that was dated 1,200 hours on the 20th. And I might add, Mr. Chairman, that it had a number of facts in it, or a number of pieces of information that during the course of the what resulted from that meeting that afternoon and then further changes overnight were deleted. It included, for example, the fact that the Israelis had vouched for the reliability of Mr. Ghabanifar, although he was not named by name. It included the fact that NSC had, in fact, asked for the use of the proprietary in November 1985. It had the name of the proprietary. It mentioned Mr. Hakim and the fact that he was a designated contact point.
These were things that were in the statement when you last saw it.
Yes, sir. It included the fact that the Iranians had agreed to provide a portion of the tows to the Mujahideen as part of the deal. It included meetings that had taken place between Mr. North and Rafsanjani's nephew, and between I think Mr. Cave and a relative of Khomeini's. It did not have a lot of the detail in it that was later added in terms of the dates and numbers of the arms shipments that were added later in the afternoon and so on. But there was a fair amount of detail in there that had not been in before. And I think it's the recollection of at least one or two of the people who were involved in putting the testimony together that the only reason that there was mention of the November 1985 flight at all in the testimony was because I insisted that. Most of the others, presumably because of the uncertainties, had argued against mentioning the November flight, but I insisted on putting it in.
So there were substantial differences between the last version of the statement, both additions and deletions, as you saw it when you left for the day, and the time it was presented to the committees.
Yes, sir.
And as I understand it, Mr. Casey and his assistant took over responsibility for making further revisions after you left for the day. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think there's another draft dated 8 o'clock that evening, and then there may have been another couple of drafts the next morning.
Mr. Casey appeared before the House Intelligence Committee the next morning at 9 a.m. and before this committee at 11:15 a.m. He returned to the House Committee at 1:30 to complete his testimony. Did you attend these hearings yourself?
I did not.
Let me turn now to questions about one or two very specific areas, and then I will turn the questioning to the Vice Chairman. I think that sequentially this might just be helpful if I could, for the sake of the committee and later questioning by the members, get one or two of these points concluded before I cease my questioning at this point, because other questions may want to build on it. The December 5th, 1985 finding. According to the statement of former CIA General Counsel David Doherty, in the course of preparing the Casey testimony, an attorney in his office, Bernard McCufka, found an unsigned copy of the December 5th, 1985 retroactive finding, which he gave to you at a meeting at CIA, which as best we can determine is the meeting which took place with the staff on November the 19th in the early afternoon. This is one of these meetings you were having with the staff.
Yes, sir.
He says he brought this to your attention and you said you would look at it. The committee has a copy of this document which we'll show you now. Do we have a copy here? Document which purported to be a finding, the retroactive finding, unsigned, December 5th. Do you recall General Counsel Doherty providing this to you?
I have no direct recollection of it, Mr. Chairman, but I have certainly no reason to quarrel with it.
Are you not sure whether it was given to you in this meeting or not?
I assume that it was.
Assume that it was.
Yes, sir.
But you have no direct personal recollection of it.
That's correct.
Did you relate it to anything you had known about earlier, for example, a meeting in John McMahon's office?
No, sir. I had completely forgotten about the December 5th, 1985 meeting in Mr. McMahon's office when I had still been Deputy Director for Intelligence. And I was not reminded of that meeting until his assistant reconstructed her notes of the meeting about a week after Mr. Casey's testimony. As we have tried to reconstruct the putting together of Mr. Casey's testimony, it is clear that there was a major dispute over this finding and whether it existed, whether it had been signed, what its status was, and the net result of it was tremendous uncertainty and a general sense on the part of most people that in fact there had been no such finding. But there was a great deal of uncertainty about it.
Take any action with respect to any unsigned copy of a finding given to you that Mr. Doherty recalls giving to you at this meeting or showing to you at this meeting?
No, sir, only to see that some of these matters were tracked down. I know that at one point somebody told me that Mr. McMahon or Mr. Junowitz might have some information, and it may have been in relation to this finding, and I directed them to telephone them and find out.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question
Yes,
at
sir.
that point?
Yes, sir.
I'm a little baffled by the uncertainty about the existence of the finding. Aren't there records kept or files kept that clearly indicate whether a finding has been made or not made?
Yes, sir, there are, Senator Cranston, and this is one of the things that I found fairly strange about this entire affair. Nobody had seen, that I was aware of, had even seen this finding. There was uncertainty whether it had even been signed. I think most people were aware that there was a January 17th finding, but we didn't even have a copy of that, and we didn't get a copy of that finding until I urged Mr. Casey to ask for it in October of 1986. So it was one of the, I'll be honest with you, one of the several aspects of the whole Iran-Contra affair that from the standpoint of CIA was incredibly irregular. The idea that that we had such uncertainty. Now, I think that it did not trouble people so much at that time because there had been no operational activity between the November 1985 flight and the signing of the January 1986 findings, so that there was no sense of concern on anybody's part that operational activities had taken place subsequent to that November flight that would have required a finding. So I think that people were, I suppose, less concerned about their uncertainty for that reason.
Thank you.
Mr. McCufka discovered the finding, and I apologize for going on a little longer on this point, but again, we're related to the preparation of testimony, and I want to try to nail this down. Mr. McCufka discovered the finding, also recalls that Doherty told him that you had raised the matter of this finding at a meeting with North and Poindexter, and that either or both had told you, I'm talking about North and Poindexter, had told you the finding does not exist. McCufka says he then relayed this to Charlie Allen, who he discovered was aware of the existence of the finding, which he referred to as the mini-finding. Allen confirms this account and recalls subsequently phoning North about the matter and being told bluntly, the finding does not exist. Allen then called McCufka back and told him that the CIA raises this, it will be our word against theirs. Did you in fact ever raise the matter of the unsigned retroactive finding, the so-called December 5th finding, with North or Poindexter?
I don't remember doing so, no, sir.
So you wouldn't recall if they had any response because you don't recall raising it?
No, sir.
Looking at this strictly from CIA's point of view, if the White House insisted the finding did not exist, then it would mean that CIA had provided assistance to the November 1985 sales without proper authority, would it not?
Well, sir, we had a long discussion about this in 1987, and I think that where the General Counsel's office came out, and again, I'm having to defer to the various attorneys involved in this, and frankly, it sounds to me like they're splitting some fairly fine hairs here, but I think their argument was that the decision of those in 1985 who allowed the proprietary, or who allowed the proprietary to make this mission, acted properly based on the limited information that they had at the time they made the decision. The reason that Mr. McMahon became upset when he learned about it early the following week, the next Monday, I think this happened over a weekend, was that McMahon had been told that there might be further such flights, and he realized that any kind of continuing effort like this would require a finding. And I gather that, as again, trying to piece it together in retrospect, that that was the view of the General Counsel at the time, Mr. Sporkin, and further that Mr. Sporkin wanted to try and write the finding in order to cover the November flight itself as sort of the beginning point of that. There's no question in my mind, from a policy standpoint, that there should have been a finding at that time.
Right. Well, Charles Allen has also told the committee that he attended a meeting in the morning of Thursday, November 20th, 1986, with Mr. Casey, where he raised the matter of the earlier finding, which he described as a minute finding, and that Claire George told him quite firmly the finding did not exist and he should drop the subject. The Director Casey's calendar for that date shows you were in attendance at this morning meeting. Do you recall Mr. Allen having raised the matter of the finding, of the retroactive finding at the meeting with Casey, and being told to be kept quiet by Mr. George?
No, I don't. I don't know why there would have been any embarrassment or reluctance to include mention in the testimony about the finding. If it existed, it would have, I think, strengthened CIA's position, not made it look worse.
Well, just to refresh your recollection of what was going on at the time, the President held a news conference on November 19th, same day you were meeting with Poindexter North, where he said basically that it was not arms for hostages. The wording of the December 5th, 1985 unsigned so-called retroactive finding flatly contradicted that. We now know that Admiral Poindexter ripped up the only signed copy of this finding on the afternoon of November 21st, the day of Casey's testimony, to prevent political embarrassment to the President. Were you ever told by Poindexter, North, or Casey that you should not raise the retroactive finding because it would be politically embarrassing to the President?
Absolutely not. And I must tell you, Mr. Chairman, that as somebody who has sat in the bureaucracy and also sat in the White House for a long time, when there is a politically controversial event or a foreign policy catastrophe, which was what people believe we were confronting that week, the general instinct of most bureaucracies is a very real willingness to throw the President overboard at the first chance.
So I've indicated earlier in our summary as we've gone through it, Casey's prepared testimony failed to mention the speculation concerning the diversion of arms sales funds to the Contras. And while you've said at different times that there were just bits and pieces about this, including what Charlie Allen had told you and what you'd passed on to Director Casey, the fact is, if they were true, they would arguably constitute a violation of the law, in effect, at that time, which prohibited U.S. assistance to the Contras. Did it occur to you at this time that that would have been a violation of the law, and would it have made a difference in terms of your calculation not to put even some speculation of the diversion into the Casey testimony at that time?
No, sir. After we had given Mr. Allen's memorandum to Admiral Poindexter on the 15th, I then left on a trip for the Middle East for some 2 weeks, and it broke my continuity with this entire business. I think that the thing that we were focusing on, and I think it may help explain why I sent Mr. Allen to Mr. Casey, but also I think helped shape our approach in November, was that the revelation of what Mr. Allen talked about in his memorandum, and there were various conversations about operational security, really focused more. What operational security really meant was we were on the verge of a foreign policy catastrophe. What Mr. Allen was basically saying in his memorandum, and the speculation about a diversion has taken on great significance in retrospect, as it properly should. But at the time, the focus was on the fact that we were on the verge, or the very great likelihood, of the revelation of, in fact, an arms for hostages policy that would not only have tremendous repercussions here at home, but also overseas. And that clearly was what was shaping our thinking at the time in November. So it was this operational security, this foreign policy aspect of it, that I think was preoccupying most people. And frankly, having not heard any new information about a possible diversion, it just didn't occur to me to put it in the testimony.
One other matter in the testimony, the November 1985 flight, obviously we've had discussion going on about what the cargo was. CIA had been told by North that it was oil drilling equipment, but CIA lawyers recalled being briefed that it was missiles or some types of arms. An early draft of Casey's statement stated that no one in the U.S. government had learned that the cargo was missiles until mid-January 1986. Subsequently, this was changed to read, no one at the CIA had known what the plane had carried until mid-January. And in the end, this sentence was taken out of the director's statement altogether on the basis of former General Counsel Sporkin's clear recollection that he had known a few days after the flight that the cargo had been arms. I guess that was during a discussion about whether there should be a finding or not, as well as conversations Casey had with Poindexter and others. The prepared statement Casey actually delivered said only that, quote, the agency was asked to recommend a reliable airline that could transport a bulky cargo to an unspecified location in the Middle East. When the plane got to Tel Aviv, the pilots were told the cargo was spare parts for the oil fields and it was to go to Tabriz. There was no mention that Sporkin or anyone at the CIA recalled learning within days of the flight that missiles or arms or munitions of some kind had been aboard. There was no mention of that some people in the agency had been told that. When Director Casey was asked by Senator Leahy later in the questioning when the CIA had learned that the November 1985 flight had carried missiles, Casey reverted to the sentence in the statement that had been deleted the night before and said the agency didn't know until the Iranians told them sometime in January '86 by way of complaining about the inadequacy of whatever was delivered. While it may be understandable the director was in no position to provide a definitive answer in terms of what CIA as an institution understood to have been on this November '85 flight, or when CIA officially learned this, why was there no mention that some present and former employees at CIA, particularly the former general counsel, recall being contemporaneously aware that the flight carried missiles or arms? Why would that have been? And why would not the oversight committees have been advised of that possibility?
Mr. Chairman, that part of the testimony was completed after I had gone home, and frankly, in all of the disputes and telephone calls of that Thursday evening and late into the night, I guess I was considered sufficiently on the periphery. No one ever called me about it at all. Trying to figure out what happened with this sentence about who knew what when has been one of the most difficult aspects of this testimony. As best as we have been able to reconstruct the sentence that no one in the U.S. government knew about the flight, knew what was on the airplane, never appeared in one of the drafts of Casey's testimony. I think what happened, and again I have to be a little tentative because of the nature of all of this, I think what happened was that when Casey and I went down to Poindexter's office on the afternoon of the 20th, we took with us a one-page chronology of CIA's involvement in the Iran affair. On that chronology was an entry that said no one in CIA knew what was on the plane. This had not been changed to reflect the discussion that I had had with Mr. Doherty the preceding afternoon, indicating that there was growing doubt about who in CIA had known what was actually on the plane. In any event, during that discussion, either Colonel North or Admiral Poindexter, and I've not remembered which, said, well, no one in the U.S. government knew what was on that plane, and Mr. Casey wrote that on that one-page chronology. I think that that is what then gave rise to Mr. Cooper's concerns that then involved, through the course of the evening, Judge Sophia and a variety of other people. But in none of the drafts of Mr. Casey's testimony that the agency has been able to locate does that a sentence appear in his testimony. And I think the reason that there is no reference to it is that late that night there was this long argument between Mr. McCullough and Mr. Doherty. Mr. McCullough was the staff officer handling the final drafts of the testimony with Mr. Casey, Mr. Doherty, the general counsel, debating between them and perhaps others about exactly how accurately they could say what had happened, and they finally gave up in despair that they couldn't figure it out and struck the sentence, or Mr. Casey struck the sentence, because he couldn't be sure what the facts were. I think that the slow progress of our investigation was reflected that a couple of weeks later when Mr. Casey testified, I think the sentence ended up back in to the effect that no one in senior management at CIA knew at the time what was on the plane. But I think it was the basis of I think it was this confusion and uncertainty that night that led them finally just to strike it all together because they couldn't be sure what was accurate. But that was all after I had left the scene.
A couple of other quick final questions on this subject of the testimony. We now know there were efforts by Colonel North to construct false chronologies to conceal the role of the United States in the November '85 flight. Were you aware of any other attempt by North, Poindexter, or Casey to deliberately conceal U.S. or CIA knowledge of the November '85 flight from the intelligence committees?
No.
In this regard, Poindexter later testified that when he spoke to Director Casey at his home late in the evening of November 20th, this would be after you'd already left, that he told him that they would have to be cautious in terms of what they told the committees about the November 1985 flight. Did Casey ever report this conversation to you?
No, sir, I don't think so. I might mention, Mr. Chairman, that one of the ways that Judge Sophia and the others got involved was that I had authorized Mr. Doherty late that afternoon to make copies of the next draft of the testimony available to both the Secretaries of State and Defense. He then asked me if we could make it available to their general counsels as well, and I said I didn't have any problem with that, but it was up to the secretaries. So I was trying to get the information around in a way that people who could double-check the testimony had access to it.
After Mr. Casey gave his testimony on the Hill, did you seek to find out what he had said to the committees?
No, sir. He spent a good part of the day on the Hill, certainly all morning and into the early afternoon, and then I was leaving for California that weekend, so I don't recall any discussion with him about it. Normally, when people come back from testifying on the Hill and you say, "How did it go?" they always say, "Went fine. It just went really great." I don't think anybody ever lost a point in testimony on the Hill by their own account.
The DCI's calendar says that he saw you twice on Friday, the 21st. This has been after the hearings, and that you had another meeting with him the next morning concerning Iran, I guess before you left on the trip for the weekend. Did you use any of those meetings as an opportunity to ask him any more details about his testimony, or to discuss his testimony any further with him? This would have been again after he'd given the testimony.
Yeah. I'm fairly sure I didn't. I'm sure I asked him how it had gone and just a general statement of that kind, but I don't recall any further discussion than that.
Why didn't you follow up more to find out what he'd actually said, since you had been tasked to work so hard on helping draw a lot of this together?
Well, sir, one of the reasons why I think I had not been involved late on the evening of that Thursday and so on is that I really was sort of a tag-along that week. I tagged along with him to Poindexter's office where we had that meeting, and I tagged along with Mr. George when he went down to debrief Mr. Poindexter on his meetings with the staff. Part of the problem was that these, certainly the most controversial aspects of all of this, affected a period when I had been Deputy Director for Intelligence and had no direct and in many instances even indirect knowledge of the facts that had taken place. And in fact, I think that it's that a number of the people who have been involved in the and been interviewed by this committee in connection with the preparation of that testimony have said at one time or another that it was clear that I didn't know what the facts were or that I was not very well informed, although I was trying to get everybody to put as much into the testimony as we could.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. There's some other items that I want to ask you about in regard to the Iran-Contra Affair, but these seem to me the two most important in terms of the diversion and the preparation of the testimony, items that we should cover to lay down a predicate for additional questions that will be raised in the hearings. I obviously am anxious to question you also about your ideas about the future of intelligence, the redesigning of the intelligence community, the appropriate role of education to improve intelligence analysis, how we might use intelligence to effectively deal with international environmental problems and challenges, and a lot of other issues. But perhaps we'll have an opportunity to return to those, but I wanted to turn to those items that I felt were most important for us to examine in the very beginning in terms of your past actions, and to get those into the record and hear your further explanations, since we've had an opportunity to question you about these matters before any additional statements that would shed light in answering these questions. I appreciate your directness and the answers that you've given. Now going to yield to the Vice Chairman for his questioning. Let me say to my colleagues that immediately after the questioning of the Vice Chairman, we will take about a 5-minute recess. We will then return for a round of questions beginning with Senator Nunn, followed by Senator Warner, and then Senator Hollings has yielded his order at this time to Senator Metzenbaum, so Senator Metzenbaum would follow Senator Nunn and Senator Warner in the order of questioning. I might ask those members that are present and any of their staff, the staffs of those that are not present, if they could to please let our staff director know the approximate amount of time that they think they will want to have in terms of asking questions. Again, that will just help me somewhat in scheduling and determine whether or not we need to go into the evening.
Mr. Chairman, if I could interrupt you. As you know, Senator Metzenbaum and I also have the Thomas hearings, and you know, I can probably come when my time is up, when I'm notified here. So if the staff could let me know, that'd be helpful too. I can tell them how much time I want, but I need to have a little advance notice if possible.
We'll notify you, what, 15, 20 minutes before, or a little earlier than that?
Yes, sir, if possible, because there are some witnesses that, matter of fact, some from my state of Arizona, I obviously would like to be there at the Thomas hearings when they come. They won't be until Thursday, probably.
Let's do this. Let us notify you when it's when the person before you starts speaking. If you can't come, then we'll try to switch an order with you with someone else.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, just
that.
an observation.
Warner?
The subject of Ollie North was raised this morning by myself and others with the hopes that, and you responded to my request, that you act promptly to determine whether or not there's any feasibility. My understanding now, and I'm pleased with it, this issue is now over and done with, and he will not appear as a witness before this committee. There's no basis for any request we continue or delay the hearings or anything like that.
No, I would say, Senator Warner, I see no reason to do that. As I say, Mr. North's relevance would be on the essential point of whether he had discussions with the nominee on this matter of
I thank the
diversity.
chair and I thank the vice chairman.
And the special counsel and the counsel for Mr. North have indicated that it's not going to be possible for us to go through that process.
The senator was the senator from Virginia here when the chairman read the testimony of Oliver North concerning Mr. Casey's knowledge? Okay.
I'll turn now to the Vice Chairman, and as I say, following the questioning of the Vice Chairman, and I apologize to my colleagues, I did feel important to finish that particular subject. We will then have a 5-minute recess after the questioning of the Vice Chairman, and then we will return to the others as I've indicated. Senator Murkowski?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I feel that I'm being held as a hostage for the recess, but I would like to compliment the chairman. I think the extensive questioning certainly signifies the tremendous research that has been done by our staffs, and I assume in the tradition of this body that when we leave Mr. Gates and finally wind up this hearing, it will be in the tradition that there are a few unspoken questions left by our colleagues, which is as it should be. However, more specifically, Mr. Gates, in your concluding remarks of your testimony, you lamented to the statement that you should have asked more questions, should have been less satisfied with the answers you received, especially from Director Casey. I'd like to go into a line of questioning relative to just what that relationship was, recognizing that there was a formal structure within the agency. And in order to understand why certain persons in the agency would have knowledge about the diversion or the alleged diversion of money to the Contras, and certain people did not. And of course, it's important to understand that we understand how the CIA operated under William Casey. I have before me a kind of a briefing on an organizational chart that lists Director Casey as the director, of course, and you, the deputy director of Central Intelligence. And then you were also chairman of the National Intelligence Council. And you had dual positions. Can you explain why you had dual positions under Mr. Casey's directorate?
I was appointed Deputy Director for Intelligence in January 1982 when Harry Rowan resigned as chairman of the National Intelligence Council in September 1983. Mr. Casey asked me to take on that responsibility as well, and so I held both positions through the time until I became Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. I think he felt that perhaps I could bring some of the changes to the estimates that I had in the CIA's analytical product.
Now, there was also an executive director under the organizational chart. I believe it may have been a Mr. Taylor at that time. And Mr. Taylor, according to the organizational chart, was under you. There was a director, then the deputy director, then the executive director.
That's correct.
In a normal organizational chart, you'd assume that the reporting went up from the executive director to the deputy director to the director, or down, as the case may be. What was Mr. Taylor's function?
Mr. Taylor was, in some respects, the day-to-day manager of CIA. He took care of budget matters, a lot of personnel matters, a number of administrative kinds of tasks. Once I became deputy director, I reconstituted a review group to review covert actions periodically and ensure that they were being administered properly, and that the management was satisfactory and that they were accomplishing their objective, and Mr. Taylor chaired that group. So he had a number of responsibilities along those lines.
But he was not, from the information that I recall, named or in any way apparently involved in any of the alleged Iran-Contra information or testimony given, or was that by structure as opposed to the organizational chart, or was there some other reason that basically the third top person was apparently not in the loop, so to speak?
He basically had no involvement at all in any of those things, and I don't know that he was sort of consciously excluded, but he just did not have a part.
Well, I'd like to address Mr. Casey's management style as a director of Central Intelligence, because I think it's appropriate to this organizational chart. Anybody can read it, but it implies a chain of command, which you assume would be, in any corporate structure where the second or third would have some idea of what the president or the CEO was responsible for, and therefore, if he had a stomachache or whatever, could basically take over and operate with some continuity. Can you explain for me just basically how the agency operated under the structure as dictated by the director, Mr. Casey, as opposed to the organizational chart, which clearly shows a structure that one would assume would be a normal reporting structure?
Yes, sir. Let me address your point in two respects. First of all, Mr. Casey's personal style, and then the way the agency operated, and particularly insofar as it affected the clandestine service. I think that the first thing in terms of Mr. Casey's personal style was that this was a man who had begun his intelligence career as an OSS officer in Europe. It was a time when, needless to say, there was no oversight, and even management, I think historians would agree, was fairly slack. He then made his career essentially as an operator, as a lawyer operating on his own, and as an author. In essence, he never worked, or he did not work through much of his career in a bureaucratic structure, although he had several senior government positions in State Department and the SEC. But his basic inclination was to operate pretty much on his own. And so Mr. Casey, when he first arrived at the agency, and actually for the first several years, it was something of an adventure to work for him, because he would pick up the phone and punch a button without much concern for who was at the other end of the line, and start shouting instructions. And after I became DDI, John Stein, the DDO, and I would occasionally have to straighten things out, because Mr. Casey would call Stein thinking he was in charge of analysis, or giving him an analytical assignment, and occasionally he'd call me and think he was talking to Stein and give me some kind of operational guidance. And I'd have to go straighten it out with Stein. He also would fail to change the buttons when he'd call again. So he'd call, and then about 30 seconds later he'd call again, and you'd say yes, and he'd say, "Who's this?" And you'd say, "Well, this is Bob, and you just talked to me." And he said, "Oh, well, I didn't want you." And then he'd hang up, and sometimes that would happen 2 or 3 times. So he was very, shall we say, unbureaucratic. I don't think he would have recognized the CIA organization chart the first several years he was there, if a lot depended on it. So his own personal style was very anti-bureaucratic. He had a tendency to go after an individual or a job that he wanted done, and he didn't pay much attention to the structure in getting that done.
Well,
Now let me say a word about Mr. Casey's relationship with the clandestine service, because I think it's applicable here. And let me begin by saying that, contrary to what a lot of people think, it's been my experience in government, and leaving aside Mr. Casey, that deputies usually are not in the chain of command to the principal in a department or an agency in this respect. You do not need to go through the deputy to get access to the director or to the secretary in most of the departments and agencies that I'm familiar with. You do not need to go ask Larry Eagleburger if you want to go see Secretary Baker, or the same thing in defense. Similarly, the deputy and the principal tend not to work entirely on the same issues. There's just too much work to do. And so often you will have a deputy who is working on a different set of issues than the principal, and the overlap in what they know is usually far short of complete. So that if you want to talk to a deputy about something that the principal has been concerned about, he usually will have to go get briefed. This even happens in a little shop like ours at the NSC between Scowcroft and myself. Now let me talk about Mr. Casey and the clandestine service. First of all, the CIA has always had a certain mystique and uniqueness, I think primarily due to the clandestine service. And as a result, the director and the clandestine service have usually had a very special relationship. It's been my observation when I was in the agency that DO division chiefs, for example, had far readier access to the director than their counterparts in any of the other directorates. I tried to encourage Mr. Casey to see the DI office directors more frequently, but he would not reach to them in the same way that he did to the clandestine service. And in fact, I remember early on when I was his chief of staff, every now and then he'd meet with a division chief, and the division chief would come out of the meeting, and I would say, "Don't you think you ought to fill in the deputy director for operations?" And he'd say, "Oh, he doesn't need to know any of that." So DO division chiefs, at least in my experience, were far more powerful than their counterparts elsewhere in the agency. I believe that when Mr. Casey came to CIA, he came with the view that he, in essence, would involve himself very deeply in operational affairs. I won't say that he intended to run the clandestine service because he wasn't organized enough to do that, but rather to involve himself very deeply in its affairs. And frankly, I think it is one reason why he appointed Mr. Hugel as the Deputy Director for Operations at one point, was because he basically wanted to be in charge of the show himself. Nowhere was this more true than on those issues that were a special passion for him, like Central America, and where he would reach down into the organization and basically ignore all of the bureaucratic aspects. And in fact, in an Inspector General report in the fall of 1986, they were very critical of the fact that, as an example, the chief of the Central American Task Force chain of command ran directly to Mr. Casey, which meant bypassing not just the deputy and the executive director, the 4 deputies, but also the division chiefs. So there was a tremendous leap from Mr. Casey down to this task force director, but that was not uncommon for the way he did business. So I've gone on at some length, but I wanted to try and describe both his personal style, which was very task-oriented and very unbureaucratic, and also his relationship with the clandestine service that accentuated some aspects of that style.
Well, you certainly, I think, highlighted the fact that Mr. Casey wasn't a team player exactly, but I'm curious to know, you indicated, like on the Central American matters, that he would reach down and come up with a confident and then initiate some action or another. How did he get to know these people at this lower level and their degree of competency? Did they play poker together, or did he have a social dialogue with them? It seems that an agency this large, one at the level of Mr. Casey, would have few opportunities to get to know people at a lower level that had the capability of carrying out various activities without some long-term association motivated by social contacts or whatever.
I don't think he had much social contact. I can't be certain of that, but I think most of them he met through briefings and meetings where he would be being briefed on various things, and he would find somebody that he liked, or their name would be on a piece of paper, and he would just reach to them directly.
When you appeared before us in 1986 for confirmation as Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Bill Casey was the director at that time, and you noted that you and Casey had agreed, and I think that this was be recalled by my colleagues, agreed to establishing a division of labor and that he would keep you fully informed on all covert action matters. And of course, later when the Iran-Contra matter became public, it appeared that you were not in the loop. Can you explain to us how you reacted to what was clearly obvious, that you were not in the loop, that you were being left out of certain things? Did you meet with Casey again after this effort to try and put together this division of labor and communicate your displeasure?
Senator, when I was being confirmed for deputy director, Mr. Casey and I did talk, and we generally agreed that there were no areas from which I would be excluded, such as clandestine operations or something like that, that I wouldn't be confined just to the intelligence community or technical issues or analysis or something like that. In the event, I think what happened was that, first of all, I was a little naive about how much work there was to do and the degree to which my time would be taken up by a number of other issues. The intelligence community, its structure. I spent the first 3 months after I became deputy director trying to bring about a change in structure of the intelligence community staff. The amount of time that I would be involved on the Hill, the amount of time in administration and budget, and I must admit that I continued to spend a lot of time on analysis. Toward the end of the summer, 1986, I decided to try and become more involved in operational activities and began getting briefings on 3 particular covert actions that I thought were particularly important. But I have to admit that I moved fairly slowly in terms of involving myself in the clandestine service. There's no secret that there was a certain strain between myself and the clandestine service when I became deputy director, coming out of the analytical arena. There was not only an unfamiliarity, but I think a little uneasiness. Also, Mr. Casey's relationships with the DO had been pretty well set by that time. He'd been director for 5 years, and I was reluctant to try and interfere in those relationships. So, although I had the highest aspirations in 1986, early spring of 1986, that we would be fully integrated, it didn't work out that way. Now, at the time, it seemed to me that just because there was a lot of work to do, the fact that I was on the periphery of certain things and didn't know much about some things didn't bother me very much. It seemed to me that that was just an outgrowth of the amount of work that had to be done and my focus on some other areas. And frankly, it was only after he became ill and all the investigations started and so on that I began to consider that it hadn't just been the way the division of labor had worked out, but that I might have been consciously cut out of something.
Well, it appeared that the concept of a division of labor had more meaning in its symbolism than it did in actuality. And I assume that when the concept was raised, I assume by you, that you had high hopes that this would be an understanding, and as a consequence of that, you could expect to be in the loop, so to speak. And I don't know whether, who initiated this so-called division of labor? Was it from Mr. Casey, or was it suggested by yourself?
I don't think it was ever that formal.
It wasn't that formal.
I think it just happened. I became immediately involved in the intelligence community staff restructuring, and there was a lot to do with the budget and so on, and I basically just took that on.
Well, it would appear to have had some significance from the standpoint of those of us on this side of the desk because of the symbolism associated with what would normally be construed to be an understanding, but an understanding implies that if both sides aren't happy with it, one brings up their unhappiness with the other. But I gather that in this division of labor understanding, the fact that you were obviously not in all the loops didn't distress you enough to go back and cite your concern to Mr. Casey.
No, sir, because I thought it was just an outgrowth of the amount of work that had to be done.
Could you give us a little description of the relationship of Mr. Casey and Mr. Claire George, who at that time was the director of operations, and also Mr. Alan Fires, who was head of the Central American Task Force, and I think at that time was at least 4 or 5 levels removed from Mr. Casey. And how did Mr. Casey work with them, and how did you work with them in relationship to your responsibilities in the senior position as deputy to Mr. Casey? And were you, when you observed this direct communication, how did you mentally reflect on it? What were your thoughts when you obviously knew that he was going direct to these two and obviously several others as well?
Well, as I indicated earlier, first of all, it's a common practice in the agency for the 4 deputy directors to deal directly with the DCI. That was not unusual with Mr. Casey at all. They had ready access to him, basically walk-in privileges, and I know that, or I had the sense that Mr. Casey thought highly of Mr. George as an operations officer and as an imaginative person who was responsive and trying to make some of the changes that Mr. Casey was interested in improving the clandestine service, increasing the number of officers overseas, and so on. I had no reason to think that Mr. Casey had anything other than a very positive opinion of Mr. George. In terms of Mr. Fires, I think that Mr. Casey saw him as a very capable officer with a lot of promise, somebody who had the potential of becoming a very senior officer in the clandestine service, very effective in his position. I think he liked Mr. Fires. Beyond that, I don't have much insight.
Well, it seems a bit inconsistent for Casey to have that kind of a relationship 4 or 5 levels down with Alan Fires, but I'd like the record to note that although you mentioned it, Mr. Gates, regarding the Central American Task Force, the CIA's Inspector General's report in the fall of 1986, which states that the chain of command was bypassed and ran directly from Alan Fires to Casey. And you would just acknowledge that.
Yes, sir.
We received the relevant portions of that Inspector General's report on the Central American Task Force and inserted it into the record at this point.
Frank, could I ask one question that relates to your questions?
Please proceed.
Has it occurred to you that if Mr. Casey knew about the Iran-Contra transactions but shared the information with others but not with you, that he may have done that because he thought you might strongly object to the transactions?
I think that's a very real possibility. I have been told, and it's nothing other than secondhand, but that there were some feelings in the clandestine service that I had too close a relationship with the Congress, and as well as the suspicion of my having come from the analytical side. Also, frankly, on Central America, the Directorate of Intelligence had been fairly critical of the prospects for the Contras, and I'm sure that that had a certain spillover.
CIA's Inspector General's report in the fall of 1986, which states that the chain of command was bypassed and ran directly from Alan Fires to Casey. and you would just acknowledge that.
Yes, sir.
We received the relevant portions of that Inspector General's report on the Central American Task Force and inserted it into the record at this point.
Frank, could I ask one question that relates to your questions?
Please proceed.
Has it occurred to you that if Mr. Casey knew about the Iran-Contra transactions but shared the information with others but not with you, that he may have done that because he thought you might strongly object to the transactions?
I think that's a very real possibility. I have been told, and it's nothing other than secondhand, but that there were some feelings in the clandestine service that I had too close a relationship with the Congress, and as well as the suspicion of my having come from the analytical side. Also, frankly, on Central America, the Directorate of Intelligence had been fairly critical of the prospects for the Contras, and I'm sure that that had a certain spillover effect as well.
If I may, I wonder, Mr. Gates, did you ever express your opinion to Mr. Casey about selling arms to Iran?
Yes, sir, I did. The only occasion that I can remember specifically was not until September, in which I told him that I thought that it was a bad idea. I do remember that in January of 1986, when I was first briefed on the finding and was told that by Mr. McMahon, and told that we were going to have to provide intelligence to the Iranians, that I was bitterly opposed to that, and I think perhaps in that context I told him that I thought that the whole idea was a bad one. And he shared with me the fact that in early December at a meeting at the White House, he too had opposed it. At that time, he sent a memorandum, in January I should say, sent a cable to Mr. Casey saying that we were opposed to this, but had been directed to do it by Admiral Poindexter, and that unless we heard differently from Mr. Casey, we would proceed.
That was the extent of it?
Yes, sir.
And you never heard any more from Admiral Poindexter?
No, sir.
And how inclusive was that discussion concerning the possibility of arms sales to Iran? Did it go any further, or was just a question of arms sales? There was no discussion of diversion? Or?
No, sir. The conversation, as I recall it, that I had with Mr. McMahon was focused strictly on the arms sales and the context of trying to get some hostages out, but also trying to arrange an opening to Iran. There was that element to it. But I remember Mr. McMahon, perhaps in that same conversation, telling me that both Secretary Shultz and Secretary Weinberger also were very much opposed to the initiative.
You, just for the record, clarify so that we don't draw a conclusion that there may have been a compromise in the discussions that came up in September concerning the potential sale of arms to Iran, and your first acknowledgement of the so-called diversion, which was, I believe, October 1st?
That's correct. The meeting in September, where I recall this, and actually I was reminded of it after my testimony in 1987 by Mr. Allen, was a meeting that was held after three more American hostages were seized by the hostage holders in Lebanon, and Mr. Allen reminded me sometime in spring of '87 that at that meeting in September I had told Mr. Casey that the whole thing was a bad deal and should be stopped, that we would never be through with it. And all of that still pertaining to simply the sale of weapons to Iran.
That was the extent of it,
yes.
The sale of weapons. Returning just a moment to Director Casey, tell us a little bit about his relationship with Dick Kerr. You've indicated the relationship with Claire George and Alan Fires, but Mr. Kerr was DDI, and I gather had the analysis side of the responsibility.
Yes, sir. I think the thing to recall about Mr. Casey, and it was true of me, and I think it was true of the others as well. However close we may have been professionally, there was really, despite some of the things that have been written, a certain distance in a personal relationship. In the personal relationship, Mr. Casey was almost 30 years older than I was at the time. Different generation. His friends were people his own age, basically. My wife and I did not ever go to the Caseys for dinner when we weren't in the company of other people. Never visited their homes in Florida or Long Island or any place. I'm not saying anything negative about it. I'm just saying that the relationship was essentially a professional one. Mr. Casey had a good opinion of Mr. Kerr. He dealt with him in connection with the aspects of the job, but beyond that, there really was not much reaching out. It was not the kind of thing where Mr. Casey would ever ask me about my family or anything like that. It was a very professional kind of relationship.
With your contacts with Mr. Kerr, did you work from a formal agenda, or were you very, very informal?
It was exceptionally informal.
Exceptionally informal, so you just passed on whatever thoughts are.
Exactly.
Regarding Mr. Kerr's recollection that he mentioned the diversion to you on August of '86, let me be a bit direct. Are you denying that he mentioned it, or are you saying you simply don't have a memory of it?
I don't have a memory of it.
That question will probably be asked again and again. Returning to Mr. Casey's relationship with various persons, did he always keep you informed of the details of his conversation with John Poindexter?
No, Mr. Casey was not very good at feedback. He would go down to the White House, and even when he would have meetings with the president, finding out what had happened was usually something of a chore. He usually would only do memoranda for the record if an action needed to be taken, as I recall. But he would go to NSC meetings and other kinds of meetings, and particularly if he had private discussions or something like that, it was exceedingly rare to get any kind of feedback from that.
Let me read to you an excerpt from John Poindexter's sworn testimony before the Iran-Contra Committee on July 16, 1987. The testimony relates to a meeting Poindexter had with Casey. The chairman has already brought a portion of this up. You, Ed Meese, Assistant Attorney General Cooper, on November 20th, 1986. This is the day before Casey testified before our committee on the Iran arms deal. And I read from page 112 of the transcript, and I quote, Poindexter, in hindsight, what I should have done is adjourn the meeting and met separately with Ed Meese and Bill Casey so that we could hash through the issue. Question, and this was Arthur Lyman's question, were you uncomfortable with the fact that Mr. Meese had brought his Assistant Attorney General, Mr. Cooper, and that Casey had brought his deputy, Mr. Gates? Poindexter said, quote, yes, I was. Mr. Lyman, and as a result, you did not express your point of view at that meeting. You stayed silent. Poindexter, quote, that is correct. I wonder if you can comment on this testimony in general terms of how you felt about clearly the significance of this dialogue.
Well, I certainly I remember Admiral Poindexter testifying to that in 1987, it just seemed to me that I'm not quite sure how to respond, except that it helped explain the speed with which the change that I had, or the correction that I had wanted to make was agreed to. And I do recall Admiral Poindexter being fairly silent in the course of the meeting, but beyond that...
Well, could you elaborate when your interpretation of Admiral Poindexter's acknowledgement that he was upset as a consequence of the discomfort over the fact that Mr. Meese had brought the Assistant Attorney General, Mr. Cooper, and that Casey had brought his deputy, namely you? I mean, clearly, Mr. Poindexter was not happy with that.
He did not indicate that at the time. I guess my first reaction on hearing it was that he hadn't trusted me, and that was the first indication that I had heard that.
That he hadn't
trusted me, and I guess in the context of the circumstances, I wasn't unhappy with that.
I wonder if you would care to comment, or if you can comment on a Monday, March 24th meeting that allegedly took place at 6:30 when Don Regan came to see Casey and told him of Attorney General Meese's discovery of the diversion. Testimony from a sworn witness indicates he went home pale and bothered, and Bill was never the same again, and everything went downhill physically. Did you observe that, I guess, personality change in Mr. Casey as a consequence of that meeting, or what occurred about that time?
I think based on the testimony of a number of people, Senator, that I may have been one of the last people to notice a physical change in Mr. Casey. I did not notice a real change in him until toward the, let's see, it would have been around the 10th or 11th of December. And someone came in to tell me about, I had originally been scheduled to give a speech. I think my memory of this is correct. There was a memorial service or a memorial to be held at LaSalle University in honor of Bob Ames, who was one of our officers who was killed in Beirut. And there were a lot of ceremonies associated with it, and I think it was late in that week, around the 10th or 11th of December, and Mr. Casey decided to go up and deliver those remarks, and I can't remember whether I was originally scheduled to and urged him to do it instead or whatever, but to honor Bob Ames. And I was told by a couple of people who had been on the plane with him that on the flight back from LaSalle that night, he had been holding a drink, a cocktail, and tipped it sideways and didn't even realize that he was spilling the drink, and someone reached over and just righted his hand. Then that next morning he had an interview, I think a Friday morning, he had an interview with Time magazine and just went totally blank at one point for some period of time. Sometime in there, the security, one or another of the security people who accompanied Mr. Casey told me that he had been falling down at home. And so we urged him to go up to his place on Long Island over that weekend and rest. And he did that. I don't remember whether he left on Friday or Saturday. But he just seemed tired to me, and it had been a very stressful period, obviously, but he just seemed tired. When he came in, I'm sorry.
Just go ahead.
When he came into my office, I think the next Monday morning, he came through the door and was sort of moving.
What date might that have been?
I think it was the 15th
Of,
December, 1986, and he was moving sort of from piece of furniture to piece of furniture, and he did look terrible. And we talked for a couple of minutes, and then he went back into his office and collapsed shortly thereafter. He had been saying to me that he thought it was his blood pressure medicine or something like that that just wasn't agreeing with him. But I didn't notice any real physical change in Mr. Casey until that preceding week. Others said that they noticed it much earlier, in keeping with the interview that you just quoted.
did you have an opportunity to meet with Mr. Casey around March 24th or the 25th, which I believe was the day that Attorney General Meese made the, November 24th?
No, sir. I was in California during that period.
What were your dates for California? When did you leave?
I think I left over the weekend, maybe on Sunday, and came back Tuesday.
So you were gone the
Wednesday.
day before.
Yes, sir.
Let me follow with some rather brief questions, continuing with regard to places and events. You became DCI, the number 2 person at the CIA, in April of 1986, and give us a brief outline of what your priorities were then and on up to October of 1986 when you learned of the diversion.
My first priority was to change the structure of the intelligence community staff to create in it an evaluation capability that would give us, as we went into a period of what I expected to be declining rates of growth or declining budgets, a basis for making judgments about how best to invest the resources that we had available, some capability to gauge one collection system against another in terms of the amount of return that we would get in terms of intelligence product, and what kind of system would affect the greatest number of requirements that we had. I had 2 problems. One was bringing about the change itself, and the second was finding somebody to do that job. I went through several candidates. It was fairly time-consuming, and finally, with Mr. Casey's approval, selected Douglas George to head that function. So I spent the first while that I was deputy director on that. I also had a major trip to the Philippines in June and spent a fair amount of time preparing for that.
Tell us how well received your efforts were to reevaluate staff and so forth and so on. Were you the bull in the china closet, or were you graciously received? Did you make enemies, make friends?
The idea of an evaluation staff was not particularly welcomed either on the intelligence community staff or elsewhere, because if it really worked, it had the potential to change in some significant ways the way we did business. I wouldn't say that there was overt resistance from most places, but it was a difficult change to bring about bureaucratically.
Was part of it because of your relatively rapid ascension in responsibility and title within the agency, where perhaps you had moved ahead of some who'd been senior to you?
Well, there may have been some of that. I thought it seemed to me more just bureaucratic protectionism.
Sometimes that's very sacred to the bureaucracy. Before becoming deputy DCI in April of '86, had you ever supervised clandestine activities or covert actions in the agency?
No, I had not.
Your qualifications to do that, recognizing that this goes with the job, is based on what, in your own mind?
Well, I had a pretty good understanding, I think, of what the intelligence business was about, but I would have to admit that I had very little experience with the clandestine service other than serving in the same organization over a period of time. The relationship between the directorates of intelligence and operations was a very awkward one for a long time. In fact, when I first joined the agency, there were armed guards and barriers between the two directorates. Ironically, I think put there by the analysts.
Well, they do the best they can, yes.
When I was a young analyst, we were given the name of one junior reports officer in the Soviet division, and that was the only person we were allowed to talk to. So I think that gives you a measure of the cultural gulf that existed in the agency. Now, I think that had begun to change over time, and there had been more cooperation. I think that it, I won't say it stalled, but it slowed significantly when Mr. Casey came on the scene. I considered it a considerable achievement when I was Deputy Director for Intelligence, when I was able to recruit Bob Ames out of the clandestine service to become the head of our Near East Analytic Office. And one of the great tragic ironies was that after a lifetime in clandestine service, it was as an analytical supervisor that he was killed in Beirut. But all my efforts to try and get that road to run two ways, to get some senior DI people appointed into the DO and to increase the number of contacts, it was very difficult, and we didn't make much headway. So while there has been progress in recent years, and there had been some progress before, the gulf between those two directorates is very real. I was struck, someone who had talked to this committee I heard about saying that in describing why someone had not told me about something or whatever, said, well, he's from another world.
Let's move from analysts to allegations, and I'd like to, let's just take a few minutes, Mr. Chairman, wind this up as my portion of the questions. There have been a number of allegations made concerning your activities related to an alleged covert CIA program to ship arms to Iraq. You're aware of that. Some have even linked you to the so-called October surprise meetings alleged to have taken place between the Reagan-Bush campaign officials and Iranian officials. These allegations have been chiefly made up by two individuals, Ari Ben Menashe, I gather a former civilian translator for the Israeli military intelligence, who is reportedly in Australia to avoid Israeli authorities and prosecution, and Richard H., I guess it's Babian, a self-professed arms merchant and former member of the Iranian intelligence service, who is currently in a Florida jail awaiting trial on security fraud charges. Now, for months we've watched while these allegations of these men have been heralded on ABC's Nightline or Public Broadcasting System's Frontline and a host of other news outlets. Our committee staff has also been investigating these allegations, and when our resources were limited, we asked the FBI to help us out, and they have. We've also asked the CIA Inspector General to independently investigate the allegations. Now, after months of investigation, the allegations of Mr. Ben Menashe and Mr. Babayan have been found to be without merit. After reviewing travel records, your official calendars, conducting numerous interviews, and referencing agency records, neither the FBI nor the CIA Inspector General has been able to place you at the meetings or the places these individuals have alleged you to be. You've had to silently endure these allegations for some months. I know it has been exceedingly frustrating for you and your family. Therefore, I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to them publicly on the record and under oath. So I'm going to ask a series of questions laying these allegations out. And I'd like also to know what you think the motivation for these allegations might be. First, Ari Ben-Menashe claims that he participated in a meeting with you in Santiago, Chile in 1986, along with Mr. Carlos Cardon, who allegedly brokered millions of dollars in weapons to Iraq. My first question is, did you ever attend such a meeting?
No, sir.
Have you ever met Mr. Carlos Cardon?
No, sir.
Did you ever encourage Mr. Cardon or the government of Chile to supply Saddam Hussein with weapons?
No, sir.
Dr. Gates, the ABC News program Nightline on July 12, 1991, claimed that a former, and I quote, CIA operative, unquote, had personal knowledge of at least one meeting in 1986 in Florida between yourself and Carlos Cardon. Did you meet with Carlos Cardon in Florida in 1986?
No, sir.
Have you ever met with him?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
It may interest you to know that Cardon says he never met with you either.
I understand he was very disturbed at being put in my company.
Now, I have a July 16, 1991 letter from Carlos Cardon to our ambassador in Santiago, Chile. I believe that letter's in the record, Mr. Chairman, but if it isn't, I'd like it to be.
For the record.
And I quote from the letter, quote, yesterday, with stupefaction, I believe that's what he says here, in indignation, I received the transcript of a television program on the ABC network. In this program, I am accused, among other things, of having been the link through which Mr. Robert Gates and the CIA delivered arms covertly to Iraq. In like manner, the program indicated that there had been one or more meetings between Mr. Gates and myself. As you will understand, Mr. Ambassador, these charges are causing me serious and irreputable damage, not only because of their total and absolute falsity, but also because they are one more stage in the campaign spearheaded against me by the U.S. government. Now, the outcome of this campaign has been that presently in the United States, any lie can be uttered publicly against me as a consequence of the systematic manner in which I have been slandered. Mr. Ambassador, I formally protest the incidents described in this letter and reserve the right to take any legal action in order to defend the integrity and transparency of my activities and the honor of my name. Yours truly, Carlos Cardon. Dr. Gates, according to the Ari Ben-Menashe, according to him, in mid-October in 1980, you were present at the site of a meeting in the Ritz Hotel in Paris, France, attended by a group of Iranians. Vice presidential candidate George Bush and William Casey, who was then manager of the Reagan-Bush campaign, was there as well. Do you have any knowledge of such an event in Paris?
No, sir.
Were you in Paris at any time during October of 1980 for any reason?
No, sir.
Do you have any knowledge whether any persons associated with the Reagan-Bush campaign of 1980 sought to delay the release of hostages held by Iran until after the election in November of 1980?
No, sir.
Did you personally ever suggest to any representative of the Reagan-Bush campaign or to the candidates themselves that negotiations should take place with Iran to delay the release of American hostages?
No, sir.
Mr. Ben-Menashe has also said that you attended 2 additional meetings with representatives of Iran between January and October 1980 in Madrid, Spain. Do you have any knowledge of such meetings?
No, sir.
Did you ever attend such meetings?
No, sir.
Were you ever in Madrid, Spain at the time, at any time during 1980 for any reason, bullfights or anything?
No, sir.
Ben-Menashe also says that you attended these meetings as George Bush's personal representative. Did you ever in 1980 serve as George Bush's personal representative in any matter?
No, sir.
According to Mr. Ben-Menashe, you met him at the Miami airport accompanied by a U.S. Customs official sometime between January 1st and January 20th, 1981 to assist him in gaining entry to the United States with a large sum of money in cash. He says he flew to Miami from Guatemala City en route to Phoenix, Arizona. He also says that you accompanied him on that flight to Phoenix, Arizona. He further says that he was carrying $16 million in $100 bills in cash. Now, you would remember whether you were in Miami in January of 1981 to meet Mr. Ben Menashe, would you not?
Yes, sir.
And your memory
No, sir.
says that you were not. Did you ever accompany him on a flight to Phoenix, Arizona?
No, sir.
Did you assist Mr. Menashe in transporting or counting the $16 million in $100 bills?
No, sir.
Ben Menashe also says that on July 3rd and 4th, 1987, in Kansas City, you met with Iranian Defense Minister Mr. Ben Menashe. Do you know anything about such a meeting?
No, sir.
And finally, according to Mr. Ben Menashe, on April 20th, 1989, you met with him in a private home in Paramus, New Jersey, regarding the subject of arms sales to Iraq.
Paramus. We're told.
Paramus.
Paramus.
All right, that's better. New Jersey's a long way from Alaska. Did this happen?
No, sir.
Now I'd like to turn to some of the allegations made by Richard Babian, the self-professed arms dealer now awaiting trial for securities charges in a Florida jail. Have you ever met Richard Babian?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Babian claims that he first met with you and a Mr. M.K. Moss in Geneva in June of 1984. Is this true?
No, sir.
Babian claimed that you, working with M.K. Moss, ran a covert CIA operation to supply arms to Iraq. Dr. Gates, have you ever been aware of any CIA or U.S. government covert operation to supply arms to Iraq?
No, sir.
Babian claims that you were a very good friend of Carlos Cardon and that one of your pet projects was to transfer cluster bomb technology to Carlos Cardon. Dr. Gates, were you ever involved in an operation to transfer cluster bomb technology to Carlos Cardon?
No, sir.
Now, Dr. Gates, I will ask you a few questions about the weapons that were allegedly transferred to Iraq via South Africa by a company in Lancaster, Pennsylvania called International Signal Control, or ISC. Before the CIA was informed by the FBI in December of 1986 that ISC was under criminal investigation, were you aware of possible illegal activities on the part of ISC?
No, sir.
A story in the Financial Times alleged that you may have gone to visit ISC in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Have you ever met with officials of ISC?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Have you ever been to Lancaster, Pennsylvania?
No, sir.
I wonder if you'd give us a short synopsis, and that will conclude my questions, Mr. Chairman, of why, what's the motivation for these seemingly outlandish and far-fetched efforts to associate with your good nature?
First of all, Senator, I'd like to thank you for making that public, as you suggested. Putting up with this all through these months and these various television shows and so on has not been easy, and even some of my neighbors began to look a little askance at me, wondering if while I was a Soviet analyst I was running guns to Iraq and selling cluster bombs to Carlos Cardon. I don't know what these people's motivation is. I think it's an illustration, though, that the more specific that you make the allegation and the lie, the easier it is for some people to believe it. I'm just grateful to have it straightened out and cleared up, and I'm afraid that my views on their motives and of them probably not appropriate for this forum.
Probably be inappropriate to question why the press would give it such wide notoriety without checking it out, but I won't. I'll save that for the chairman.
I certainly appreciate the vice chairman being sympathetic to me, and we won't pursue the rest of these questions since we are part of the family television viewing hour in terms of whatever the nominee might think about some of this. We're going to, just a moment, take a brief recess. I want to welcome our former vice chairman, Senator Cohen, who's joined us, who certainly made an immense contribution to the work of this committee in the past. And Senator Cohen, we're happy to have you sit in with us today. We're going to take a brief recess for about 5 minutes. Let me say that I have been totaling up the time that members have told me that they intend to potentially take. So I do think, unfortunately, it will be necessary for us to come back. The Senate is expected to be in session tonight anyway, so we will come back, of course, in about 5 minutes, but then we'll probably recess around 6 o'clock. We'll begin with Senator Nunn when we come back, then Senator Warner, and then Senator Metzenbaum will occupy Senator Hollings' originally scheduled time slot for 30 minutes. Then we will recess again and probably return approximately at 7:30. So we'll take a 5-minute recess at this time.
May I
Yes.
just inquire of you, what is the reason that the chair feels that it's imperative to work through the night on several different nights? What is this matter has not moved that rapidly, and I don't know whether the chair, how fast the chair intends to move it, but I get the feeling there's a sense of urgency, and yet the matter has been sitting here for a good many
Senator
months.
Metzenbaum, I would say there's no sense of urgency about it, but as you pointed out, the matter has been sitting here for several weeks. The nomination, I've forgotten the exact date, I cited it in my opening statement, in which the nomination was submitted to the committee, I believe was on June the 24th. And it's now well into September. And of course, there have been a lot of reasons why we have taken time. We wanted to get everything we could get from the special counsel. We do have several witnesses on Thursday, 7 witnesses in fact, several of whom have indicated to us for some time that because of their travel plans, they're available on Thursday. They're not going to be available on Friday. Some of them are not going to be available for 2 or 3 weeks because they have plans to go out of the country. I don't want to lose the opportunity to get the testimony of those witnesses. Some of them are witnesses that members of this committee have requested, and several of them are, and so I want to have a chance to do that. Simply my hope that, as we know, once we've heard all of the witnesses, we're going to have an opportunity if either members of the committee or if the nominee, either one or both, wish to have additional testimony from the nominee, that we'll have that opportunity. But my hope was, since we will of course be recessing at 5 o'clock tomorrow because of Yom Kippur, not in session on Wednesday, these other witnesses scheduled on Thursday, which would disrupt our questioning of Mr. Gates, I was simply hopeful that we might be able to finish, for the sake of continuity, the first initial questioning of the nominee before we break for these other witnesses that we have scheduled on Thursday. Then there'll, of course, be an opportunity to come back to that. We have also the questions on intelligence we have to have in closed session on Friday. I've already said it looks unavoidable to me that we'll be back the following Tuesday of the next week, maybe Wednesday, I don't know, maybe Thursday, we just don't know, to take up some matters of intelligence sharing, some other issues related to Iraq and other countries. So that's the reason. As I've said, we will go on as long as we need to go on to do our job properly, but I just felt that in terms of the initial questioning of the nominee, it might be helpful to keep our train of thought going and not to have the continuity of it interrupted. And Thursday, we really do have to interrupt for these other witnesses.
I understand the Thursday situation, but I do have the feeling, Mr. Chairman, that it's going to be difficult to conclude the hearings by tomorrow night at 5. That is the inquiry.
The initial inquiry, Mr. Gates.
Well, if it's, I think so. I expect to have several hours of inquiry.
I've understood that you might have 2 or 3 hours, and I've had 1 or 2 other members of the committee say they would have more than half an hour. Most of the members of the committee apparently will have half an hour. So it is possible. If we go on another 2 hours tonight, we would finish the rounds of 30-minute questions by approximately noon tomorrow, and which would leave another probably 4-hour time block before 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Now, if we don't finish at that time, we just don't finish, and we obviously will come back. And as I've indicated all along, every member of this committee, this certainly includes my friend from Ohio, as he well knows, will have every opportunity to ask any question they want to ask. These hearings are not going to be completed until all the members of this committee have a chance to ask not only this witness, but others, all the questions they want to ask them.
Is it the plan that each member will take a half hour in the first round? Is that Chair's?
That'd be the plan, and then we would come back. And if we, for example, were to finish up most of the questioning of the other members of the committee, let's say by noon tomorrow, and there were 1 or 2 or 3 members of the committee that wanted to go on for, say, an hour or 2 hours or whatever time period, we would then just go into that questioning at that time and see what it is that we complete. But on Thursday, we really do. We have Mr. Polgar, we have Mr. Fires, we have Mr. McMahon, Inman, and all of these others that have been scheduled, and several of them have told me that they're going to be out of pocket, some of them, for some time. So that's the only reason I was hoping to keep our train of thought going while we're making progress here.
Well, Mr. Chairman, there's a thought brooding on this side, which is that we'll give up our time tonight to let the senator from Ohio just keep going straight, keep going his 2, 3, 4 hours that he wants to question.
I have no problem about that.
Now, I'm not sure the rest of us will all be here to hear the answers,
Rhode
but
Island will stay to hear the line of inquiry. I would want him to be present so that I might enlighten him.
Mr. Chairman,
I would feel lonely if the senator from Rhode Island were not here.
well, don't count on it.
Chair.
Seriously, I mean, if the senator from Ohio says he's got 2 or 3 hours of questioning, and
Let me ask
We
of
can
my
throw up,
colleagues, also the senator from New Jersey has indicated to me that he will probably have a somewhat more prolonged questioning as well. I don't know how much longer. I don't know if it's more like an hour or how much. But that we could proceed with that in the morning, and then we could proceed with the other rounds.
Chairman, I was just going to inquire as to what the chairman had found out from the various committee members. How much questioning do we have, exclusive of what we know the senator from Ohio wishes to question?
We have, I would say, approximately 30 minutes from all the other members of the committee who have not yet asked questions. I have about 30 minutes of additional questions that I think from a committee institutional responsibility point of view that need to be asked on 1 or 2 of the other Iran-Contra issues. So the record is clear. We have Senator from Ohio who estimates maybe...
Mr. Chairman, let me just make this clear. I think that there is probably no more nominee that going to come before the Senate than Mr. Gates this year. We're hearing a Supreme Court nominee. I think that's extremely important, but I don't think it's any more important than this one. And I'm not talking about 2 or 3 hours because I want to drag it out. There's no purpose in doing that. I just think that the thrust of my inquiry to the chair is that I think we ought not to be under any pressure.
No.
I think we ought to be able to explore fully. I think that Mr. Gates's comments this morning as to his sense of responsibility about some things that had happened
Yes.
certainly places a little bit different light on some matters. But it's as if the senator from Ohio has some insidious purpose in wanting to add. I know what it is to filibuster on the floor. There's no filibuster in there. I just think there's a sense of responsibility.
I understand, and I want to make it clear that I for one, I don't think the other members of this committee would either, for a minute, question the motivation of the senator from Ohio in wanting to ask these questions other than just his determination to be thorough and doing his job. As I said in the beginning, these hearings are going to have 2 attributes, I hope, and that's fairness and thoroughness. And as far as I'm concerned, we have not done our job and completed our work as long as there are members of this committee who have sincerely have questions that they feel should be answered. This senator certainly did not hurry himself in the opening questions that I asked, and I think it would have been wrong for me to have done so. So I want to make it clear that there will be no one cut off from an opportunity in this committee, nor will anyone's motives be questioned. That's the whole. We all take this very seriously. This is a critical post of the government. I think the nominee understands our responsibilities as well, and but I would suggest that if the other members would be agreeable, it might be helpful that when the senator from Ohio begins this questioning, that we allow him to go ahead and continue as he wishes, rather than, say, making you do 30 minutes, come back and begin a train of questions.
I'll do whatever
again.
the chair wants to do.
Would that be agreeable after we have Senator Nunn and Senator
That's
Warner?
agreeable to me. Certainly, he can have my half hour.
I want to assure the senator of Ohio he's not going to be questioning to an empty hall, because I intend to stay here for every minute of his questioning. I'm interested to hear what he has to ask, and I'm particularly interested in the factual predicates he lays on the Iran-Contra matter. So I think it's an excellent suggestion, and I think it accommodates the senator from Ohio, and it accommodates the committee, and it accommodates the future witnesses. I think it's a splendid
I might add,
suggestion.
Mr. Chairman, that Senator D'Amato has agreed to relinquish his time as well to the senator from
on this
Ohio.
side of the aisle to us. After we return, we'll have Senator Nunn's round of questioning, Senator Warner. They will commence Senator Metzenbaum's round of questioning. We will come back at approximately 7:30. We'll see what time we take a break. And then, or we might even take the break and then come back and let you begin at that point and move through. And then we can judge how far along you are in the questions you want to ask by the time it's...
I would
well,
suggest
I certainly not presuming we should stay to midnight or anything like that. We're not going to stay to an unreasonable hour.
Stacked votes, Mr. Chairman.
We have stacked votes at 6:30.
Therefore, I think the wise thing is after the lineup you announced,
Right.
that we return at 7:30.
I think that's what we'll plan to do. Let's...
As many of us want to be here for Senator Metzenbaum, and indeed Senator Bradley and others.
Well,
We
let
all
me
want.
suggest this. It's going to be about 6 o'clock by the time we complete. Why don't I suggest this, that we have the questioning by Senator Nunn, Senator Warner, then we recess until 7:30, at which time we'll commence with Senator Metzenbaum. Now, following Senator Metzenbaum would be normally Senator D'Amato, would it not? So
Senator D'Amato has indicated his willingness to give
All right,
his
we might
time
want
to
to let
Senator
him know that if
Metzenbaum.
Senator Metzenbaum does complete tonight and there's still time for Senator D'Amato, that we would either have him tonight or start in the morning with Senator D'Amato, and then he would be followed by Senator Bradley.
Mr. Chairman,
We'll just see where we are at that point.
Mr. Chairman, members, if they're not aware, should be aware, I believe a vote is scheduled at 6:30 on the floor.
I think we have maybe 3 back-to-back votes at 6:30, so this would accommodate us. We'll start about 7:30, maybe 7:45 if the votes go along on the floor, and we'll return then. We'll take a 5-minute recess. We'll come back then for the questioning of Senator Nunn and Senator Warner and follow the remainder of the procedure. We'll resume, and again, I would call the nominee's attention to the fact that we continue to have testimony under oath in terms of his answers to the additional questions which will be asked to the members of the committee. And at this time, I'll turn to my colleague from the state of Georgia, Senator Nunn, who will begin his questioning and then be followed by Senator Warner, after which time we will then recess until we begin with Senator Metzenbaum's questioning at 7:30. Senator Nunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gates, I want to shift your thinking a little bit from the past to the future, particularly relating to your statement in your prepared statement where you state and cite the need for a remedy to the gap between the 21st century collection systems and the 19th century system for informing policymakers. I found that to be not only intriguing, but I think very important when we look to the future. As I understand it, as Director for Intelligence for several years, you were in charge of intelligence assessments. And intelligence assessments are the primary vehicle through which policymakers are informed. So you have a unique perspective on this. What is it that is lacking now in informing policymakers, and what is it you would do to improve that? Because after all, intelligence is to no avail if policymakers do not have access to it and understand it in a timely fashion.
Senator, what I had in mind in my statement this morning is that we have spent a great deal of money, billions and billions of dollars, on collection systems, particularly technical collection systems that can deliver information to us in real time or near real time. Then too often, our analytical components will look at that information and sit on it overnight to print it in the President's Daily Brief or the National Intelligence Daily the next morning. So in a system where we've spent perhaps tens of billions of dollars to get the information quickly, other than in crisis situations, we then wait and deliver the information pretty much the same way it was delivered by the War Department a century ago, and that is by the written word on the succeeding day, like the daily newspaper. It seems to me that this is an area where in the new age we need to be more supportive of the policymaker and his needs throughout the day. And what I have in mind is a proposal that I made and that failed in the mid-1980s that would provide electronic intelligence to the policymaker, where the several score most senior policymakers in the government would have monitors where throughout the day the intelligence would be updated for them on situations all around the world, and where it would be integrated so that there could be maps and photographs and so on, so that not just when it's convenient to the agency or the intelligence organizations, that is developed overnight or the preceding day, the policymaker at his convenience during the course of the day could receive continually updated information. I think that we have not, frankly, taken sufficiently into account in the intelligence business the implications of the arrival on the scene of CNN and other 24-hour-a-day news broadcasting systems. And as a result, I think much of our current intelligence is in fact old news by the time that it reaches many of the policymakers. There are other areas where I think that support from intelligence is inadequate. I think that many of these problems are continuing problems. They are problems that have been around for a long time. There is a sense that assessments are often not sharp enough, that the policymaker has to wade through too much prose to get to the bottom line, a sense that alternative views are not sufficiently spelled out, that there is too much of a presumption of a right answer and a wrong answer, when in fact the policymaker may be better informed by simply knowing better how to think about a problem than an answer in a situation where there may be no answer. So these are two areas where I think that improvements can be obtained. And my specific reference this morning was to the one where I think we need to take a new look at the way we provide current intelligence support for policymakers.
You also went on in your statement to say, on the question of human intelligence, you state, quote, "At the same time, we must consider the implications for our covert action capabilities of a dramatic decline in Soviet aggressiveness and disruptive activities in the third world," end quote. You were alluding to the need to improve human intelligence. Is it fair to draw the conclusion from that you believe covert action is now less important as a tool with the decline in the Soviet threat and the decline in the Soviet aggressiveness around the globe, and that human intelligence, on the other hand, is more important? Is that a fair conclusion?
Yes, sir, it is. I think that one of the areas where we have had a terrible problem over a long period of time in intelligence is in the realm of political intelligence, the question of intentions. There was an allusion made to it earlier with respect to Iraq and the decision to launch the war or invade Kuwait. If you look back at most of the or many of the significant intelligence failures, one component of it is shortcomings in our political intelligence. I remember that President Carter sent Director Turner a letter to that effect after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, that he is not satisfied with the quality of our political intelligence. It's a very difficult area, and it is an area where, more often than not, human intelligence, clandestinely acquired human intelligence, offers a unique capability to get at that kind of information. There's another area, though, in that same regard where I think we have an underutilized asset or an underused asset. And one of the senators made reference to it in his opening remarks, and I'm afraid I can't remember which one. But somebody this morning made the comment that the contrast between the insights that they find when they travel in the field and talk to our field officers and what they get in the finished intelligence is a vivid contrast, and that they get so much greater, we use the term ground truth, when they're out in the field talking to people. One of the things that I tried to do when I was DDCI before was institutionalize a way in which our chiefs of station and officers overseas would routinely send in the kind of information that they pick up on the cocktail circuit, the gossip that they hear, what they might hear from people, from agents before they got down to serious business of the specific tasking requirements, because it is that flavor of the political climate in a foreign capital where our operations officers often have insights and information that don't get reported back to headquarters and that would clarify and give a liveliness to our reporting. I was not successful in that effort, and it would be something that I would turn to again if I am confirmed and have the opportunity to go back out there. But we need more capability in the HUMINT area, and I have to say that this committee has really taken a major leading role in trying to strengthen human intelligence collection. By the same token, I think that it is clear that the Soviet Union, or shall we say the former Soviet Union, is not going to play the kind of disruptive role in the third world, at least for the foreseeable future, or as far into the future as we can see, that it played until really very recently. And I think the agreement that was announced yesterday or the day before on the ending of support for the government of Afghanistan, Angola, and the negotiated outcome in Nicaragua, all these things illustrate that even before the revolution of the last few weeks, Soviet Union was taking a very different and more skeptical view toward these struggles in the third world. A lot of our paramilitary covert activity has been directed at resisting these kinds of things over the last number of years. I think that's going to change. The amount of money devoted to it, I think, is going to plummet. And I think that offers us some opportunities in terms, perhaps, of using some of those assets and resources on human collection.
Thank you. Let me back up into the past a moment in order to get back to questions about how you view the future, and particularly your future obligations if confirmed. During your testimony in February 1987, when you were nominated to be the Director of Central Intelligence at that time, I went through several questions with you, and they stretch out over several pages, and I'm just going to try to recall just a few of them. It gets to the question of what is an intelligence activity and what is the obligation of reporting an intelligence activity that may be, or you may think is illegal. I asked you the question back then, Senator Nunn, what is an intelligence activity? Does that include what Oliver North does in the White House basement? Your reply, quoting you, it seems to me that it covers the activities undertaken by CIA or another intelligence agency under the finding, end quote. I went on to ask, so you do not consider the National Security Council as being under that directive? If you found out the National Security Council was conducting a patently illegal activity, you would feel no compunction under the present law to report that to the oversight committees, end of question. Your answer, quoting you, my first obligation, it seems to me, would be to report it to the Attorney General because of uncertainty about whether the NSC, National Security Council, was an intelligence entity, end quote. I went on to say, well, that's the biggest loophole in the law I've seen. No wonder the executive branch was conducting everything in the basement of the White House. If you have no compunction whatever to report what is, without any doubt, an intelligence activity from a congressional point of view, wherever it's carried out within the executive branch, but you don't feel you have any obligation under the law, then we've got a serious problem. And I went on to say, I mean, the obvious thing to do is just to shift everything questionable over to the National Security Council and let it roll. And you were basically supporting the National Security Council. Your folks were supporting it. I'm astounded you don't believe the National Security Council, when they're carrying out what is obviously an intelligence activity, comes under the purview of the law, end quote. For me, you reply, Senator, it seems to me that the activity that they were undertaking was primarily a diplomatic initiative for which we were providing operational support. Now, you went on in subsequent questioning to, I think, at least modify that statement somewhat, but at this point in time, how would you answer that question?
Senator, I would regard if I thought there were an illegal intelligence activity going on in any agency of the government, I would first notify the head of that agency that I had that belief and that I believed he had an obligation to inform the Congress. If he did not do so, I would then inform the President and tell him that I felt the Congress should be informed. And if the President did not act, then I would inform the Congress, or I would resign and then report to the Congress.
Oh, I believe that's abundantly clear, and that would include Agriculture Department. If a meat inspection outfit started running guns somewhere, you would believe that would be under the purview of your obligation to report.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Suppose, would your answer be any different if the improper illegal activity that came to your attention involved a covert action in which the President's finding directed that the Congress not be notified of the covert action?
No, sir, it would not. I would tell the, first of all, I think it's worth spelling out my view on non-notification of the Congress, because I think it's tied directly to that answer.
Okay.
And it is that I don't want to get into the constitutional argument. Let me just put it in terms of how I would look at it as a matter of policy. I think that the cost imposed on the relationship between the executive branch and the Congress, and particularly between CIA and the Congress, by the non-notification in 1986 was so high that I believe that as a practical matter, I would recommend against non-notification of any finding to the Congress. In other words, I believe that Congress should be informed of every finding signed by the President. Again, not as a constitutional matter, but as a practical matter. Should there be and within 48 hours, which is the standard practice now, should the President decide for some reason involving life and death not to notify the Congress, it is my view that that non-notification should be withheld for no more than a few days at the most. Should it extend beyond that, I would argue or raise it on a daily basis with the President. And if it reached a point where I felt that the non-notification were no longer warranted, or that a relationship of trust and confidence between the agency and the Congress was jeopardized, then I would contemplate resignation. Now, under those circumstances, I think that if I were to find that something illegal were going on in that context, I would make the case to the President, A, that it made it imperative to inform the Congress, and B, that I could no longer serve as director if that could not be done.
So at that point, you'd confront the President with it, even if he had said the finding was not to be made known to the Congress. If you discovered something you believed to be illegal, or you had strong suspicions might be illegal, during that interim period before notification, you would first confront the President, say, Mr. President, I believe that this may be illegal. We must notify the Congress. And then I understand that if he said no, then you would resign. Is that correct?
I would have to see the specific circumstances, but that certainly would be my strong inclination, yes, sir.
Now let me go to people outside the government. Let's say there's another General Secord in the future. Do you believe you would have a responsibility to report to the Congress, to the congressional committees, I'm speaking of the oversight committees, improper or illegal intelligence activities of a third party involved in intelligence activities?
Involved in U.S. intelligence activities?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
What about criminal activities the CIA uncovers in the course of routine gathering of intelligence, something that is not what you would not call an intelligence activity? Let's take money laundering and take the BCCI activity that is now at least alleged to have occurred. What, if you came across that kind of information in your job to be, what would you feel was your duty in respect to that?
I would see no difficulty in having that be a part of regular intelligence briefings to the Congress. But let me differentiate in an area that's much narrower than that, but one that confronted me directly as DDCI. And I'll use the example that is that caused me to have our general counsel's office look at it. Often in the course of interviewing applicants for employment by CIA, either before or during the polygraph examination, we will come across information suggesting that somebody violated the law or may intend to violate the law. Normally, in normal circumstances, I think we notify the Justice Department of that. But one particular set of cases that came before me in 1986, where I arranged for some new procedures to be written, concerned several instances that came to our attention of people that appeared to the interviewers as potential child abusers. And we worked out arrangements with the Justice Department and the FBI where we could get that information to people and to local authorities, either social service or law enforcement authorities, so that they could at least keep an eye on the situation. So I'm trying to differentiate between that sort of thing and the BCCI sort of thing that you're talking about. And I see no reason at all why the BCCI sort of thing shouldn't be briefed as a matter of routine.
While you were at the agency, did any information about BCCI that would indicate illegal activity there come to your attention? Did you report anything of that nature?
The only report that came to my attention that I recall was I received a call in I don't remember the chronology precisely, but sometime in 1988, I think the initiative came from Commissioner Von Raab of Customs asking if we had any information or if that they had a law enforcement case against BCCI, and did we have any problem with them going forward with their criminal investigation or prosecution. And I received a 10-minute briefing by our clandestine service officers on the information that they had, a brief review of the information they had put together on BCCI, just a couple of examples of its illicit activity, but also the assurance that there's no reason why that investigation couldn't go forward. And I communicated that information to Mr. Von Raab and also sent him a copy of a report we had received. I don't know specifically whether that information was briefed to the Congress or not. There's no reason in my mind why it shouldn't have been.
In other words, though, you felt that the allegations that came to your attention on BCCI were turned over to Mr. Von Raab?
Yes, sir.
Were there any other activities of BCCI that came to your attention that were not turned over to somebody in law enforcement?
Not to my knowledge, Senator. We had one report from, well, we had done some earlier work in the mid-'80s, 1984 and late 84, early 85, at the request of the Treasury Department, and had reported all that information to the Treasury Department and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. That was through January of 85. We then had another report in September of 1986 that was sent to Treasury and several other agencies. And then I understand there was another report in May of 1989 that went to a number of agencies. Those are the only ones that I'm aware of.
Gates, the new congressional oversight provisions define the term covert action as, quote, an activity or activities of the United States government to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, where it is intended that the role of the United States government will not be apparent or acknowledged publicly, end quote. The law then goes on to exempt, quote, traditional military activities, end quote, or, quote again, routine support to such activities, end quote, from the definition of the term covert action. The conference report accompanying that those provisions, makes clear that to be exempt, the military activities must be performed by military personnel under the direction and control of a U.S. military commander, must precede and relate to hostilities which are either anticipated to involve U.S. military forces or where such hostilities are ongoing and where the fact of the U.S. role in the overall operation is apparent or to be acknowledged publicly. Do you have any problem with that definition of military activities, because it could be enormously important in the future in distinguishing intelligence activities from military activities, which trigger all the different obligations you would have?
Yes, sir. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't have any problem with it.
Clarify, Senator Nunn, are you quoting from the
Conference report.
conference report of the authorization bill, which was the last one that was adopted for 1991?
I believe so. I believe that's the case. Right. When the President signed that act, he stated, quoting him, quote, "In determining whether particular military activities constitute covert actions, I shall continue to bear in mind the historic missions of the armed forces to protect the United States and its interest, influence, foreign capabilities and intentions, and conduct activities preparatory to the execution of operations," end quote. It seems to me, and I'm not trying to make a lawyer out of you here, and you can come back and study that, but it seems to me the President swept in virtually anything in his signing of that. And it seems to me that there is a real difference, particularly when he used the term to influence foreign capabilities and intentions. It seems to me that was a very broad, sweeping situation. And what I wonder is, if we've gone through 4, 5, 6 years of defining intelligence activities, making you keenly aware of it and your responsibility, as you said, that you will be more keenly aware than anybody who's ever been in your position. Frankly, I believe you. And then all of a sudden, we've got this military activity exemption, and bang, the whole other door opens up over here. Now, we on the Armed Services Committee are going to be watching that very carefully. Without posing a question, you can comment if you like. I hope you'll get your attorneys to take a look at that. I hope you'll consult with White House counsel, or perhaps you were involved in drafting the President's statement. But I see a fundamental difference between what the conference report and Congress intended and how the President described that military activity, because the way he described military activity would virtually cover everything the CIA has done that I know anything about in covert activity. So would you take that under advisement, and perhaps in a month or two, when things quiet down, you could let the committee know how you view that and what you believe your responsibilities are vis-a-vis, quote, military activity versus, quote, intelligence activity?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just ask one other question here. Mr. Gates, you testified that Director Casey placed you in charge in November of '86 in preparation of his testimony that was going to be before these intelligence oversight committees, correct?
He addressed the memorandum to me, in which he laid out a number of things that he wanted put together for him to use. Yes, sir.
You also noted that when the CIA General Counsel recommended the testimony be delayed, you advised him a delay would not be politically feasible, correct?
Yes, sir.
You testified there was a great deal of confusion in the conference room, and that Casey was literally tearing pages and changing the prepared text, correct?
Yes, sir.
So there was no doubt in your mind that this was not only a somewhat urgent matter, but a very important matter.
Yes, sir.
Well, tell me then, after he made the changes and after he delivered his statement, or even before, when did you first read what he finally said, as opposed to what you yourself had prepared?
I assume that I was given a copy of his testimony as it was finally delivered the next day. I don't know when I focused on it after that, though. I was getting ready to go to California. I just don't know.
You don't recall focusing on it and saying, gosh, there's a lot left out here. Perhaps I better talk to the director again, or perhaps I better let somebody know that there's an awful lot missing here?
Well, sir, as I indicated earlier, a number of the details had been left out, but as far as it had been conveyed to me, most of these issues concern matters about which there was disagreement or where people weren't sure of the facts. And so I wasn't looking at it from a skeptical standpoint at all, and in fact assumed that there would be, we had indicated that we would be back to the committee as soon as we found more information, and so it was very much in that vein that it was simply the first step in what would inevitably be several attempts to keep the committee informed as we found out more.
You don't recall having read it at any point and saying, golly, there's a lot left out here, we really have made some serious omissions and we better correct it? You don't recall doing that?
No, sir, I don't.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to turn back over my last few minutes to Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Such a cooperative relationship there in the Armed Services Committee, I'm sure that.
Maybe a second.
First, Mr. Chairman,
Warner.
I wish to commend you and the staff, and indeed all members of the committee, in the manner in which this hearing has been conducted. And to our nominee, I think he's been very responsive throughout this hearing, and I think we've had a very good first day. And I hope it sets the tenor for the balance of this very important session under our advise and consent procedures. I'd like to turn now right after the questions of Senator Nunn on this issue of presidential approval and reporting on covert actions. And we come to that famous phrase, which is in Section 503C, 503C3. Whenever a finding is not reported pursuant to paragraph 1 of this section, the President shall fully inform the Intelligence Committees in a timely fashion. What is your general understanding, and what would you hope to pursue as a policy, as a definition of timely fashion?
Senator Warner, the standard practice for CIA is to notify the two intelligence committees within 48 hours of the President's signature of a finding. I think that constitutes timely notice. If there were a non-notification, if the President decided not to notify the two committees, then as I indicated to Senator Nunn, I would consider timely notice, or that period, to be a few days.
A few days. And
Yes.
so we're not getting into the area of weeks or a month or anything like that in
No,
your
sir.
judgment. I think that's very clear and extremely helpful. Under Section 503 again, those areas in which the President can make the decision to delay notification are defined as actions which are necessary to support identifiable foreign policy objectives of the United States and is important to the national security of the United States. Having spent a lifetime in intelligence as a career, give us some examples that you would think that would necessitate that type of extraordinary action by one branch in withholding information from another branch.
The only thing that I can think of, Senator Warner, off the top of my head, or actually having thought about it a fair amount, as a matter of fact, is a situation, for example, a potential hostage rescue mission, or some event that involves genuine life and death circumstances during a very short period of time.
During the course of the military action in the Gulf and afterwards, the public opinion in this nation was divided on the current policy with respect to assassination provided by executive order. What are the pros and cons of that policy, and do you anticipate bringing up with the President, if confirmed, any revision of that policy?
Well, I think the argument in favor of it is that if this government were able to eliminate a figure such as Saddam Hussein, or an earlier historical example usually used was Hitler, that many, many lives would be saved, much treasure saved, and the whole world saved a lot of trouble. I think that assassination, that the idea of the garrote or a stiletto in the alley, is not an appropriate instrument for the foreign policy of the United States of America. I'm against it. When it was legal, I don't think we did it very well. And I think that I would, if the issue were to be raised in front of the President, I would oppose a change in our current policy.
I concur in the views you've expressed. Let me turn to page 4 of your statement, an excellent statement. You said communism everywhere is dead or dying. A number of long-standing regional conflicts are coming to an end. The Cold War is over. But then you are cautious to add down at the bottom the equally important facts about the 30,000 nuclear warheads and particularly the proliferation, the distressing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological. In my judgment, this is the single most important thing that we've got to direct the resources of this country today, is to try and stop the proliferation and then develop such defenses as we feel necessary for ourselves, our allies and friends against it. What initiatives would you hope to instill in the system that would deal specifically with this question?
Senator, I think that as one of his last acts, Director Webster established an interagency center to work the proliferation problem. There's been a significant increase in the budget on issues relating to proliferation. I think something like a 75% increase in funding from 1991 to 1992, something like that. I think that there is a lot more that can be done. One of the things that I notice is that a high percentage of the resources addressed to the proliferation problem are perhaps appropriately addressed to nuclear proliferation. But I'm concerned that we may not be devoting adequate resources to both the chemical and the biological, or as one of the senators commented this morning, the poor man's atom bomb. The ease with which these things can be developed and the ease with which they potentially can be delivered is very worrisome. We have seen in the cases of proliferation around the world that at least you have a long lead time, at least it costs a lot of money, at least you need to go get foreign help. So there are a lot of opportunities to try and get at the nuclear proliferation problem, or at least be aware of when you have a problem. My worry is that in the chemical and biological arenas, you may not even know you've got a problem until too late. So the only suggestion sort of off the top of my head under these circumstances that I would have would be to look very carefully at the resources being devoted, particularly on the chemical and biological side. I think also the proliferation of these ballistic missile technologies is another area that warrants very close attention. And as I say, I think the community has already identified proliferation as a very major priority. I think it's a matter of looking at it and seeing what additional efforts can be made.
What about during the course of the coup? I mentioned it in my opening statement this morning, my concern for the fact that the underlying premise of deterrence has always been, since the aftermath of World War II, that on both sides there would be rational men that would have to make the decision respecting the use of the nuclear weapons. And here we see in the Soviet Union, for periods of time, those who had the codes were intoxicated. Right at that seat where you are, Admiral Akramayov sat and addressed the Armed Services Committee just a matter of months ago, the closest military advisor Gorbachev had, and he took his life, as did, I think, some others. What steps should our government take, and perhaps in conjunction with other governments, to try and ensure a greater stability in terms of the control of nuclear weapons?
Well, I certainly think that there are grounds for a dialogue with the leaders of the new center government in the Soviet Union and with appropriate republic leaders about command and control of nuclear weapons and how this new government intends to deal with it. Now,
will you raise that as a priority in the agency and within the intelligence structure?
Yes, sir.
Subject of arms control. If you were called in today, and the President was to ask you, should I or should I not send up the START agreement, bearing in mind that a very important aspect of that agreement should be brought up in the Senate in the foreseeable future is verification. How could we assure ourselves under a START agreement, or even during the course of the deliberation on the START agreement, that we would have an accurate knowledge of how that agreement would be verified given the fractured state of the central government in the Soviet Union today? What advice would you be prepared to give the President?
Primary advice that I would give the President is that we must devote the resources necessary to fulfill our opportunities under the on-site inspection provisions to ensure that we had the kind of people, the quality of people who were both linguistically and technically qualified to be able to see to it that the Soviets were carrying out the obligations that they had made.
Do we have adequate assets in place today to do that? And particularly if we're no longer dealing with the central government, but we have to deal perhaps with some type of central government as well as individual republics?
Well, Senator, in the vein of full disclosure, I feel obligated to remind the committee that when I testified as Deputy Director for Central Intelligence on the INF Treaty, I stated that the INF Treaty would put us at the edge of our verification capabilities, and that I thought START would put us beyond it. Now, that said, we have been able to negotiate on-site inspection provisions for START that I did not anticipate in 1986, which gives us a considerable additional insight and capability. But that said, I think we still have a problem in getting the number of inspectors that we're going to need who can speak Russian and who have a good technical background. I had this vision at one time when we were talking about on-site inspection of a 10-man U.S. team, none of them speaking Russian, and a big sign in Russian saying, "This way to the violation," and nobody could read it. The community is stretched in terms of the number of people who have both of those capabilities. And I think it's going to have to be a matter of cooperation between both the executive branch and the Congress in terms of assuring the resources in the future to be able to do those jobs appropriately.
Let's go back again to the Soviet Union today. Given the state of affairs that exists here at nearly 6 o'clock here on this Monday evening, are we in a position as a nation to continue beginning new initiatives in arms control, or should we sort of put this process on hold for a period within which the Soviet Union sought out and we know exactly with whom we deal, given that in your area of responsibility, in the i.e. verification, there are some question marks?
Well, Senator, the question about whether to go forward with new arms control initiatives is really at root a policy question.
But it hinges on the ability to have verifiable, that is, verification provisions in the treaty which come within your area of responsibility.
Yes, sir. I think that frankly, until they get themselves sorted out in the Soviet Union or in the former Soviet Union or whatever they're going to call it, until things settle down, until we have a better idea of just what the central military role is going to be, until we get a sense of who the new team is. They're having a hard time just finding people in the foreign ministry to talk to us about some of the arms control issues that we have ongoing with them right now. So until that all settles down and sorts out, I think that from the standpoint of intelligence, that it would probably be, if I may use the word prudent, to wait until things sort out a little bit.
You've given some very dramatic testimony today about your former boss, Director Casey. And indeed, I must say I was taken back by the description of the chaotic situation in the office when a dozen or so people were all trying to talk and papers were flying, and that troubles me. And then you said there's always a problem of sorting out who knew what and when. What type of organizational structure, what type of controls would you place in the agency, were you to be confirmed, that would provide for a better accountability and hopefully situations that would avoid a room full of people in complete dissension and unable to really put together a good paper? What is it you're going to do to avoid the pitfalls that it appears now that Casey fell into repeatedly?
Senator Warner, Mr. Casey had his style. I described it earlier. He was basically an independent person, lawyer, author, did not come up in a bureaucracy. And I have my style, and for good or ill, I've been in the bureaucracy my entire career, 25 years. I think I testified at one time that it may have taken Iran-Contra to give bureaucracy a good name, because using the system involves using the built-in safeguards in the system. And I think that you can use the system and take advantage of the safeguards without reducing intelligence effectiveness and without necessarily reducing risk-taking or a willingness to take risks. Now, what happened when I became acting director was that I began the set of institutional changes that Director Webster then codified in terms of how covert actions are to be originated within the agency, the internal approval process in the agency, one that ensures that the inspector, that the general counsel and that the controller and that the appropriate deputy directors, in other words, all of the people inside the agency who have a legitimate role to play that role. And then very set, established procedures for how covert actions are considered within the executive branch, including the presentation of findings to the NSC within the presence of the Attorney General and the President and so on. I think that the institutionalization of those procedures that, and I will claim some of the credit with Director Webster for putting those in place in 1987, are one of the reasons why there hasn't been a crisis of confidence since Iran-Contra in these relationships. Now, some people say that defeats risk-taking. It makes people too cautious. It makes people afraid to take chances. I don't think that's necessarily the case at all, and quite frankly, I think, without going into any detail in this open session, that our clandestine service has had some remarkable achievements over the last 2 or 3 years, and done so within the framework of the rules.
Well, in summary, would you say that there was Casey, Gates acting, Webster, and now subject confirmation back to Gates, that if you're to assume that responsibility, that you would pick up and there would be only minor modifications to what Director Webster has put in place?
Yes, sir.
And this, of course, raises the question, there's been a lot of talk, and it seems to me it's loose talk, about the morale within the agency now, and that's very important. Senator Chafee and I once had a very important department ourselves, pretty much the size of the CIA in some respect, and morale is important. How do you find the morale in the CIA today?
That's a difficult question for me to ask,
What would
Senator.
you do then to try and correct it if in fact it has slipped? Because I look at this not only from the standpoint of just a senator, but they're my constituents, many of them, in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
I have not been to the agency but once since I left there in January or spring of 1989, and that was, I think, in 1989. And so it's hard for me to judge a question like that. I think that although that question is raised a great deal, it always seemed to me when I was out there that to generalize about morale in a place as big as CIA is probably unwarranted. While all of these crises and other things go on. I remember during the mining of the harbors, somebody mentioned that this morning, the mining of the harbors in Nicaragua, and the part of the agency was embroiled in that whole thing. We just kept pumping out analysis and doing our job, and I think morale was pretty good, and the DI doing its part of the work. I think that the most important thing for morale in a place like CIA is a sense of confidence that the work they are doing is valued and important by the President, the Congress, and the American people. And when they feel that their work is appreciated, and well, maybe not as readily as we should, I think we're ready, mature enough to accept our failures and our shortcomings and to acknowledge that there have been failures. But the work that they do and the work that this committee is familiar with bespeaks a good deal of success in that, and to the degree that they feel that success is known about and appreciated, I think that has more bearing on morale than any other single factor.
And a key to that is the degree to which the President has confidence in the Director, not only Central Intelligence, but the extent that that Director also has responsibility over DIA and the other subdivisions of the intelligence. So I think it's important, and I believe that you carry that and can bring them to the round table, as I said, and make them all a full partner so that they have a sense of confidence that their work product is going directly to the President and to the members of the Cabinet and indeed to the Congress. During the course of the budget deliberations, as you know, Senator Nunn and I have responsibility for the budget in that much of it is embraced within the Department of Defense budget. And there's been a lot of hue and cry that we ought to make more and more of it public. That is, the total amount of public dollars within the DoD budget that are used for the purpose of CIA, DIA, and others. How do you feel about that direction in which I think Director Webster was quite responsive on that? He tried to reach for more openness. How would you examine that question of greater public disclosure with respect to the budget issues?
Senator, when I talked in my opening statement about perceptions of CIA and the need for CIA to do more in the way of openness, the kinds of steps that are required, it seems to me, are likely to be painful ones and controversial ones.
That's in the reorganization that must come about.
And the question of how much more information do you make public about what CIA does and the intelligence community does in order to try and build public confidence. The question of making public even the top-line budget number of the intelligence community is very controversial within CIA, within the intelligence community, and I imagine within the administration itself. The argument is made that it's the slippery slope, that if you put that number out, then the demand for more detailed number, for the breakdown then of each agency within the intelligence community will be required, and then subcategories below that and so on. My own view is that at a certain point, if the agency is to play the role that I think it needs to play, we're going to have to take some chances. And so from my personal perspective, and it's not ultimately my decision, I suppose, but the President's, I don't have any problem with releasing the top-line number of the intelligence community budget. I think we have to think about some other areas as well. But as I say, it's controversial. I must say, I think the committee was briefed, I heard this, by some of the founding fathers of the agency and the community a few months ago. And one of them mentioned to the committee that the idea of keeping the intelligence budget secret, in fact, in 1947, didn't come from the executive branch. It came from the Congress that felt that giving too much information away like that would be a mistake. I think that's one of those old issues that probably deserves to be revisited.
The staff of our committee have done, I think, a very good job in putting together a considerable amount of material for benefit of the members. And one section here is devoted to a subject called politicization of intelligence. Now, you understand that term. I have an understanding. The vernacular is cooking the books, which means that as you gather the intelligence in the field and then to come back towards the assessment, and then finally there's one or two individuals that compact it and synthesize it in such a way that it moves on up to the final echelon, and from there distributed to the president and throughout government. As I understand it, there are going to be some witnesses that are going to come in and point their finger, frankly, at your record and say you're guilty of politicization of intelligence and cooking the books. And I'd like to have you now lay a foundation for what you understand those terms to be and how you would refute such allegations.
I look forward to the opportunity to respond to those allegations, Senator. This is an area that I have grappled with throughout my career. When I was a young analyst, I was absolutely convinced that the refusal to accept my analysis was politically motivated by the people on the 7th floor at the agency. At the other end of the spectrum, as a policymaker, I have been absolutely convinced at times that the CIA and the intelligence community went out of their way to stick their thumb in the eye of the policymaker and make them look stupid. The agency itself has struggled with this issue from the beginning. You remember the missile gap in the 1950s, all of the allegations during the 1960s that the agency cooked the books on the number of Viet Cong, allegations in the early 70s that the agency slanted intelligence to support détente and arms control, allegations in the late 70s that we slanted the intelligence on energy to support the Carter administration's energy policies. The allegations of politicization in the Soviet area have continued well past my departure from the agency, and I think probably never in the anticipation that I would be back again. But just as recently as this last June, the Deputy Director for Intelligence felt it necessary to put out a circular to the analysts talking about this issue. My perception is that, or my view is that, we have a perceptions problem and we have a reality. And I think the perception of the question of cooking the books depends on where you sit. I think that most policymakers believe that the agency does, or let me rephrase that. I think some policymakers believe that the agency occasionally does have a slant. But it's the agency's own slant in the view of the policymaker, not an idea of supporting the policy. Quite the contrary, that the agency is publishing intelligence designed to weaken the policy. I think that I had many discussions about this with Secretary Shultz, and he was very concerned about our work on the Philippines and the Angola, the Soviet Union, where he felt that we had our own agenda. If you're a young analyst or a junior analyst and your work comes back and it's got criticisms written all over it, or somebody says this isn't germane or this doesn't address the question, it's a lot easier to assume that the people on the 7th floor rejected it because it was politically motivated, or their rejection was politically motivated, than perhaps their work didn't meet the standard required. The reality is that year in and year out, the agency publishes time and time and time again intelligence that challenges the policymaker and challenges the policies of any administration that is in power at the time. During the Reagan administration, we published papers saying that Soviet defense spending, the rate of growth in Soviet defense spending was going down. And if you think it was fun to publish that when Cap Weinberger was sitting over in the Pentagon, I think you'll appreciate the situation.
Well, we'll give you...
Or just to take one other example involving Secretary Shultz, the estimate that we did on Lebanon in 1983, where the first sentence of the estimate was, the prospect for the achievement of American objectives in Lebanon is very bleak. So, Senator, I think that the reality, let me just make one other comment. The reality is that I think intelligence does an honest job of reporting what it truly believes. But the belief that there is a problem is important enough that it requires constant attention, and that's why we have repeatedly had the Inspector General look at these problems or these allegations, why we've welcomed those occasions when the Hill has looked into it, and it's one of the reasons why, as I indicated in my opening statement, one of the surest protections for the objectivity of CIA's work is that virtually all of it comes up here to the Hill to anywhere from 2 to 8 committees.
That's a very good answer. You may have to follow up on that after these witnesses, but I judge you're prepared. And my last question, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, referring to your statement, some of our allies in that long Cold War are now at serious adversaries in the global economic marketplace. Then on page 9, if confirmed, I will recommend that the President launch, with the direct involvement of his most senior national security advisors, a major effort to determine the intelligence needs of the United States for the next decade or more. Now, a subject that you and I have worked on and we've discussed here is economic intelligence. And as I mentioned, and indeed others in opening statements, Senator Chafee, I think we've got to focus more of our assets in the Central Intelligence Agency as well as other intelligence agencies of the government and our departments and agencies on trying to give American industry, American traders, a competitive edge. And that requires greater surveillance of those efforts which are going on night and day. Our trade secrets, technical information, a whole host of subjects. And I wondered if you'd be willing to consider speaking with the President and the Cabinet, if confirmed, to give greater emphasis not only in the CIA and overall intelligence, but in the departments themselves. For example, there's a very small section in the Energy Department. I commend Admiral Watkins. He recognizes the importance. There's a substantial one in the Department of State, some in the Department of Defense. But again, I think rather small in the Department of the Treasury. And I'd like to see greater emphasis put on building those sections up in the principal agencies and departments of our government and coordinating through our intelligence system to really get down to business. And let's try and do everything we can to keep jobs here at home. That'll keep jobs here at home, the more we can keep our secrets here at home. The two go hand in hand. Are you willing to say that that's one of the initiatives that you referred to on page 9 that you will take up with the President?
Yes, sir.
Do you think it deserves the merit and attention that I've suggested?
Yes, sir, I do.
I thank you. I thank the Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Warner. Let me say, I think we've had obviously a very full day already. We'll come back at 7:30 and not go to an unreasonable hour. Let me assure both the nominee and Senator Metzenbaum both that we will not go to an unreasonable hour. They've both given me looks that they don't want me to keep either one of them here till midnight or so on. We will not do that. Let me say I appreciate very much some of the last comments that you've made in response to questions, particularly from Senator Nunn and Senator Warner. There are many, many dedicated people who work for the Central Intelligence Agency, and one of my frustrations as chairman of this committee, as well as I'm sure your frustration as a professional in the field, is that we're not free to talk about the successes. And as has been said, it's, I think in quoting President Kennedy, it's the failures that always get the attention in the media. become known, by the very nature of it, the successes are usually still kept a secret. And so it's oftentimes very difficult to find an appropriate way to thank those people who are providing such able and dedicated service. I appreciate your comments along those lines and about the need for them to know that their work is appreciated and also that it has impact upon policy and is seriously considered. I also appreciate your sensitivity to the fact that the oversight process itself and a normal administrative process within the Central Intelligence Agency and the intelligence community is one of the best protections that those professionals have. They will not be abused in terms of trying to be pushed to do things that they shouldn't do, that they feel are inappropriate, that violate their own ethical and professional standards, and also in assuring that their work will be considered in the proper fashion. I've often felt that those provisions of oversight which are in place, for example, are among the best protections that the professionals in the field have, because if you follow the right process within the agency, you have the right reporting relationship to the oversight committees, there's less of a chance that professionals, good professionals, are put in situations that make it almost impossible for them to do their professional duty and to do it in a way in which they think is both appropriate and ethical. And I think some of the tragedies that we've experienced, in some cases with people who are basically good people, been put in very difficult situations as professionals because the chain of command has been violated, because the oversight process has been violated, because normal process has not been followed. And so I'm very glad to hear you put the emphasis that you've placed on an orderly way of doing business within the agency and a commitment to the oversight process, which, as I say, to my mind, you have certainly demonstrated during your time as acting director and as also as deputy to Judge Webster. I've seen examples of it time and time again. Also pleased, I might say, and I don't know if you have followed the work of this committee, but when you begin to talk about those inspectors, the verification process, and the inability to find people to speak the Russian language, you know, this committee has undertaken a very strong initiative in the education area. And when we had the historians and those that were there at the birth of the CIA come in and talk to us, and we asked them their suggestions about the future, what could we most do to improve the quality of intelligence in America? I think some of us expected them to talk about reorganizing the agency or shifting resources here or there. They said, please, senators, improve the educational background of the people that will ultimately go into the making of national security policy in this country, because we don't have enough young people in this country given an international perspective. They don't have experience studying abroad. Foreign language studies in this country have been neglected. Only 8% of our college students this year are taking any foreign language. 72% of our universities don't even require a foreign language to graduate from college today in this international period. So we have suggested, many members of this committee have joined together in a national security education initiative, as we call it, to beef up efforts in colleges and universities to teach languages, area studies, international studies, and the rest of it. And we've also provided for graduate fellowships in this area, particularly related to government service later. And I hope that that's something that you will find that possible support, at least in concept, from what you've said, because I thought the example you gave was a very dramatic one of the very kind of problem at all levels of government, in fact, at all levels of our society, of having people with the international skills we now need, but particularly impacts the national security community, be it the State Department, the intelligence community, the Defense Department, and others. But I hope that's something you would examine if you're confirmed as renewed initiative in the area of education to improve our functioning all across the board, because I think that is part of national security, and I wonder if you would agree with me that it is part of the definition of national security as we're now confronting these changed world situations.
Yes, sir. In fact, part of my graduate education was part of a national defense loan.
Part of the National Defense, result of the National Defense Education Act. And we're now in a period of time in which we need to have programs like that once again, very much related to the new demands that are being placed upon us. I appreciate your patience. You've answered to my observation, our questions, with great sincerity. Made every effort to be candid and complete in your answers and to be very direct in your answers. I think we've had an excellent opportunity in this hearing process today not only put down a factual record that's very important, again, to put down a factual record that's important, but also to discuss broadly some of the more important philosophical questions that relate to the function of the intelligence community. And I appreciate the way in which you've approached our questions in this process today. We will stand in recess until approximately 7:30, when we will then begin the questioning with Senator Metzenbaum. And again, I will promise you both that we will only go on for a reasonable period of time. We'll stand in recess.